Now, what we're going to begin with Radio Free America 37 is some more information from a book that we dealt with last week called The Nazis Go Underground by Kurt Reese. We are going back to the Second World War in order to understand the historical development of an explicitly fascist political milieu that we began looking at in conjunction with the petroleum and probable intelligence careers of George Bush, the quote ex-unquote, no, he's certainly former director of the CIA, but it is a truism for any student, anyone knowledgeable about the intelligence community, that one does not become director of Central Intelligence and then sever one's contact with the agency. George Bush appears to have been involved with the CIA for a long time. His career in the petroleum industry appears to have been central to that. This is not etched in stone, but the indications are considerable that that was the case. And there is the distinct possibility that George Bush may have been involved in some way in the assassination of John Kennedy. It is certain at this point that he helped frustrate congressional investigations into possible CIA connections to both Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. It is a matter of public record that George de Mohrenschildt, one of the White Russians, one of the Gehlen-related elements that was certainly involved in the Kennedy assassination. He was one of the Oswald babysitters, an individual who spied for Nazi Germany during World War II, and then went to work, in all probability, not in all probability, definitely went to work for U.S. intelligence after World War II. He and George Bush were definitely connected and apparently quite closely. And George Bush is certainly, whether or not he was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy directly, he was certainly involved in the cover-up, and his name crops up in connection with the investigation in a variety of different ways. It was because of George Bush's involvement in an explicitly fascist milieu involving the intelligence community, the petroleum industry, the people from the Gehlen spy organization and related elements. Reinhard Gehlen was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front in World War II. At the end of the war, he jumped to the CIA with his entire organization, plus a goodly number of SS graft-ons. That organization became, in turn, the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs, the sole purveyor of intelligence on that part of the world for the CIA. It then became the de facto NATO intelligence organization, and ultimately it became the West German Intelligence Service in 1956 when the Federal Republic was incorporated. The Bundesnachrichtendienst is what it is called today. And the Gehlen organization and its development, because of their profound effect on U.S. and world history, because of the involvement of Gehlen elements and elements related to it, such as the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, because of their involvement in the assassination of John Kennedy, their involvement in a number of activities stretching right up to the present, including the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the makeup of the post-Cold War world. We are going to go back and we're going to take a look in a big, big way at the events which gave rise to the Gehlen organization, its incorporation into the United States, and next week we're going to take a look at, in detail, at the massive effect that organization has had not only on the United States, but on world history in general. This evening we're going to begin in looking at the history of the formation of this explicitly fascist milieu that we've been looking at for the past several weeks. We're going to once again go back to World War II with the book The Nazis Go Underground, with which we dealt at considerable length last week. And we're going to take a look at the Nazi industrialists' plans to go underground. We're going to take a look at plans on the part of those industrialists to ostensibly divorce themselves from Adolf Hitler, thereby losing the stigma of Nazism. And we're also going to look, and this is the most important aspect of this, at their plans to hook up, to continue networking with many of the industrialists and financiers in both Britain and in particular the United States, with whom they had done a good deal of business and with whom they were quite cozy for many years leading right up to the Second World War. In the first two Radio Free America shows, in the Uncle Sam and the Swastika Archive show, as well as the archive show called Uncle Sam and Il Duce, I dealt with what I referred to as a transatlantic industrial and financial axis, which was deeply involved with the fascist powers of Europe, chiefly Nazi Germany, but the others as well. They were not only involved in business dealings with Nazi Germany and the other fascist powers, but many of these same industrialists and financiers were also very supportive of fascism politically as well. That transatlantic industrial and financial axis, and I use the term axis advisedly, is going to be front and center this evening. We're going to take a look at the Nazi industrialists and financiers who were going underground, how the connections that they had formed under the auspices of various cartel agreements with Western industrialists and financiers. We're going to take a look at how those connections figure in the formation of this particular fascist milieu that we took a look at in conjunction with the assassination of Kennedy. George Bush is part and parcel to that milieu. That is a milieu which has been in absolute control of the United States from November 22nd, 1963 to the present, and a lot of the sorry things that have been happening in recent decades are as a direct result of that explicitly fascist milieu. We're going to take a look, as I said, in 1944 at Kurt Riess's ruminations concerning this fascist milieu and how it figured to operate in terms of the Third Reich going underground. Following that, we're going to take a look at one of the most important and most evil people in the 20th century, an individual who has had a profound effect on American history, namely Allen Welch Dulles. Allen Dulles was one of the members of the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, one of the individuals whose Nazi industrial and financial connections we looked at considerable length in Uncle Sam and the Swastika. Allen Dulles was a key operative for the Office of Strategic Services, specifically that World War II U.S. intelligence agency had as the manager of its Swiss operation in Bern, Switzerland, none other than that very same Allen Dulles. We're going to take a look at how Allen Dulles performed in a limited way with Sullivan and Cromwell. We're going to take a look at his fascist sympathies and fascist dealings, although very briefly because we looked at those in the aforementioned archive show, Uncle Sam and the Swastika. And in particular, we're going to take a look at how Allen Dulles, when he was head of the Bern, Switzerland office of the OSS, we're going to take a look at how he was networking with German-American and German industrialists and financiers, individuals who were part and parcel, as was Allen Dulles, to this transatlantic industrial and financial axis that I've been discussing for, well, many years on the program, but that we've been focusing on the last couple of weeks in particular. We're going to take a look at some people who were operating as spies for one of the factions of Third Reich intelligence, namely the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, that's spelled C-A-N-A-R-I-S. The Third Reich's intelligence system, just like our intelligence system, was somewhat factionalized, although the Third Reich intelligence groups worked together. There were also differences. The Canaris faction was largely identified with the German aristocracy, the traditional German officer corps, with the Junkers, the dominant landed interests in Germany, and although they certainly worked very closely with the main elements of the Nazi Party and with the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, and some of the more venal elements of Nazi Germany, there were also certain differences between them. Hitler's, quote, common, unquote, background and the fact that he was not an officer or an aristocrat, plus the doctrinaire racism and the prejudicial aspects of Nazism, sat poorly with some of the industrialists and financiers as well as members of the officer corps. There were also strategic disagreements, in particular between many of the officers and Adolf Hitler. So the two factions, we're going to be looking at two factions of Third Reich intelligence, the Canaris faction and the Sicherheitsdienst SS faction, the most venal factions of the Third Reich. They worked together. There were also some differences, and in particular, as the Nazis prepared to go underground, as it became apparent that the Third Reich faced imminent military defeat, elements of the Canaris faction early on, very early in the war, began reestablishing links with some of the Western powers, the United States, Britain, and so forth, and many of the industrialists and financiers who had been operating with industrialists and financiers in both Britain and the United States resumed these contacts, but some of these industrialists and financiers functioned as spies for both sides. They did channel information, even from an early period, to Great Britain and the United States. At the same time, many of them also functioned as double or triple agents as well. They also were channeling information back to the Third Reich, and beyond that, they were forming links with, they were in discussion, I should say, with industrialists and financiers from the Western nations, and Allen Dulles in particular, concerning plans to save elements of the Third Reich. Basically, they sought, some of the industrialists and financiers, including some of them who were working with the Canaris group, they sought to shake the onus of Hitler, but to retain many of the aspects of fascism, and they sought to hook up with the United States and Britain and to form what was known as the Christian West concept. The idea was for the United States and Britain and France and residual elements of the German Reich to bind together and to set up a cordon sanitaire to prevent the spread of Marxism, communism, Bolshevism, however you would like to call it, across Europe. It should also be noted that these elements were also plotting to overthrow or assassinate Adolf Hitler. The main functionaries in the Nazi Party, including the SS and the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, were well aware of this. They allowed the plots to go forward because they felt the more venal elements of the Third Reich, the SS, the Sicherheitsdienst, the Gestapo, and some of the main Nazi functionaries felt that it was politically useful to allow these individuals to conduct their plots, even though they were well known to the Nazi intelligence system and leadership and secret police, because they felt that this would be useful from a PR and tactical standpoint in helping to salvage the Third Reich and permit the rebuilding of Nazism. Some of the same contacts with people like Allen Dulles and other Western elements, other Allied elements, some of the same elements of the Canaris organization that were in touch with Allen Dulles and company were also to serve as a vehicle for the opening of discussions between SS-related elements and Allen Dulles. Now, the two main names we're going to want to look at here are two German spies. One, a German-American, an individual who is part and parcel, as we shall see, to this transatlantic industrial and financial axis. This was a fellow named Gero von Gevernitz, G-A-E-V-E-R-N-I-T-Z. This was an individual who had, as I like to say, more connections than a switchboard. He supposedly was working for Allen Dulles as a double agent against Germany, but as we will see, there are substantive indications that, in fact, he was working as a triple agent. Even though Allen Dulles thought he was working for him, there are indications that, in fact, Admiral Canaris was still pulling von Gevernitz's strings. We're also going to take a look at how Heinrich Himmler and Walter Schellenberg, head of Amt 6 of the Sicherheitsdienst, that's the SS intelligence service, Walter Schellenberg, S-C-H-E-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G, was head of the Overseas Intelligence Branch of the Sicherheitsdienst, and he was well aware of the so-called resistance, some of the Canaris-related elements that were plotting against Hitler and planning thereby to salvage elements of the Third Reich in a non-Hitler, non-Nazi Reich, so to speak. And Himmler and Walter Schellenberg utilized some people such as Hans Bernd Gisevius, one of the associates of Gero von Gevernitz, to make introductions through von Gevernitz to Allen Dulles for representatives of the SS. In addition to Gero von Gevernitz, the Dulles contact that we're going to be looking at this evening, the other main name, the other person who was conducting negotiations with Allen Dulles, was a fellow named Prince Max von Hohenlohe, H-O-H-E-N-L-O-H-E. This particular individual was specifically serving as a diplomatic/intelligence representative of the SS, and he was in direct contact, as was Gero von Gevernitz, with Allen Dulles. And this resistance group, when resistance belongs in quotes here, really this was a group that was seeking to salvage the Third Reich by dissociating itself from the more extreme elements like Hitler and the SS. This resistance group, which ultimately became a vehicle for the introduction of those very same elements to Western intelligence, and Allen Dulles in particular, in the person of von Hohenlohe, these contacts between Allen Dulles of the OSS, between people like Gero von Gevernitz and the interests he represented, and the interests represented by SS diplomatic representative Prince Max von Hohenlohe, these led to the Christian West concept. As I said, that was an idea to shed Hitler in some of the overt ethnic prejudice aspects of the Third Reich, and to form a union between the residua of the Third Reich, minus Hitler and at least ostensibly the SS, and for them to hook up with the United States, Britain, and France, and to form an anti-communist coalition with Germany as a cordon sanitaire, as a bulwark against the westward spread of communism. This was the Christian West concept, which Allen Dulles wholeheartedly supported, and which was under formation during the course of these negotiations in the middle of the Second World War. The Christian West concept and its advocates, who were known as Christian Westers, became ultimately the seed concept for NATO. And although the initial contacts between Allen Dulles and the interests he represented and the Third Reich were in the person of Gero von Gewernitz and people associated with the Canaris group, the faction of German intelligence that was associated with the German aristocracy, the officer corps, the Junkers, the vested landed interests in Germany. Ultimately, these same contacts led to direct diplomatic negotiations between Allen Dulles and the most reprehensible elements of the Third Reich, namely the SS and Gestapo-related elements, again in the person of Max von Hohenlohe, Prince Max von Hohenlohe. The Christian West concept, again, which grew directly out of negotiations between American, British, and German elements of this transatlantic industrial and financial axis, gave this Christian West concept, was the seed concept out of which the North Atlantic Treaty Organization grew. And as we're going to see, the next element that we will be looking at this evening, and this will set the stage for an examination of the formation, the explicit formation in the United States of the milieu that we looked at in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. This milieu is in control of American and world politics at this time. With the incorporation into the United States of the Galen Organization, as we shall see, the Christian West concept became a most unchristian concept, because as we will be seeing this evening, the Galen Organization, to a large extent, served not only as a vehicle for the resurrection of Nazism to a considerable extent, but it served as a Trojan horse. Literally, it served as a vehicle for the conquest of the United States, not by overt military means, but rather by covert and political means. And this particular conquest, again, was not affected by force of arms. It was, to a certain extent, with the political assassinations, but rather it was effected through the formation of political and strategic concepts. And the Galen Organization, as we will see in an examination of a long article from Covert Action Information Bulletins issue number 35, the Galen Organization literally served as a vehicle for the Odessa, for the post-World War II SS underground, to penetrate the United States, its political and military and intelligence structures. That penetration was massive, and the effects of that penetration came to a head on November 22nd, 1963. Those effects, unfortunately, are very much with us today. So the last major item in this installment of Radio Free America 37 that we're going to be looking at concerns the Galen Organization as a Trojan horse, literally as a vehicle for the conquest of the United States. That's why I call this program How the United States Lost the Second World War. And we will be looking at the same time, in conjunction with that, at the Galen Organization as a vehicle for the introduction of the Odessa, the post-World War II SS underground, into the United States, and as a vehicle for protecting the underground elements of the SS around the world. Next week, we will specifically be looking at how the Galen Organization affected the United States, not only its strategic and military policy, but its political policy as well. And this will set the stage. Next week will set the stage for our examination of how these elements, what led to these elements combining up with the American far right, the defense industry, elements of the petroleum industry, to overthrow the legitimate constitutional authority of the United States, which happened on November 22nd, 1963. So again, what we're looking at tonight, we're going to begin by taking a look at the Nazi industrialists and financiers' plans to go underground, how their proposed resumption of contacts, actually these contacts were ongoing throughout World War II, how their link-ups with industrialists and financiers in the West, in particular the United States, figured into their plans to salvage the Reich. We're going to take a look at Allen Dulles, part and parcel to this transatlantic industrial and financial axis, his negotiations with chiefly Gero von Gebernitz. We're going to take a look at his negotiations with Max von Hohenlohe and the formation of the Christian West concept, and that grew directly out of this transatlantic industrial and financial axis that we are examining. We're going to take a look at how this led to the Galen Organization being introduced into the United States, and among the things we'll be looking at in that context is not only the Galen Organization as a Trojan horse and as a vehicle for the introduction of the Odessa into American military and political life, but we're going to take a look at that very same Gero von Gebernitz and how the idea for recruiting German officers, including and especially Galen, was communicated by him to General Siebert, who was the first American military officer to begin working with Reinhard Galen even before the mainstream American high command picked up the ball vis-a-vis Reinhard Galen. We will also, by the way, take a look at Galen's close relationship with the SS and Galen's relationship with the aforementioned Walter Schellenberg, head of Amt 6 of the Sicherheitsdienst. That's what we have on tap for this installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. We're going to take a musical break, and then we're going to come back with the main body of this installment. It's time now for the main body of tonight's installment of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. And by the way, for those people who might consider the title of this program bombastic or preposterous, I in no way mean this figuratively, I mean it literally. Take a look at the world as it is and take a look at our position in it. We lost. The Axis won. What I'm looking at is how that happened, because it was a conquest not effected for the most part by force of arms, but rather by covert action. There were some force of arms involved. People like John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and a whole lot of other people will testify to that. But it was not a conquest by army groups blasting across borders. Rather, it was a conquest by political and espionage strategy, I guess you could say intelligence strategy. Now, one of the central concepts that should be borne in mind throughout the course of this entire program, and one of the central concepts that will figure this evening as we take a look at the formation of the Christian West concept. And as we shall see, that concept gave rise directly to NATO, and NATO itself, in the person of the Galen Organization, provided the vehicle for the entry of elements into the United States which were explicitly hostile to the United States and which affected the political conquest of the United States, and economic conquest in particular, in conjunction with Native American fascist elements and the link-up between the American far right, the intelligence community and national security establishment, the defense industry, the petroleum industry, and the mainstream American political superstructure. That milieu that we looked at in our first two installments is, as I said, the milieu which is in control of this country today and is in control of the world's destiny. George Bush, as we looked at in our first installment, is part and parcel to that milieu. Now, one of the central concepts that should be borne in mind, we took a look at the formation of this last week, one of the central concepts, one of the main methodological considerations that should be looked at here in terms of examining the Third Reich is how the German General Staff and the Nazi Party, and as we shall see also many of the industrialists and financiers that were in the Third Reich, learned to use the fear of communism, how they used anti-communism as a strategic vehicle for furthering their own ends. In Weimar Germany, in post-revolutionary Germany, the German General Staff, as well as the Nazi Party and many of the industrialists and financiers, learned that the fear of communism on the part of the victorious allies from World War I, the United States, Britain, and France, could be used to preserve the German General Staff, and beyond that to further the imperial designs of Germany. And it is the strategic use of anti-communism, of the fear of communism, as a vehicle for conquest by the Third Reich and the elements that led into the Third Reich and the elements that came out of it. That concept, the strategic use of anti-communism as a vehicle for conquest, as a vehicle for, at first, as it was in the post-World War I period, the preservation of the German general staff and the formation of the Nazi Party and the underground military organizations which gave rise to it. We looked last week, or we touched briefly, on how fear of communism was also used by the Third Reich as a vehicle for effecting some of its military conquests. The French army, for example, was surrendered by Maréchal Pétain, the Vichy fascist collaborator and hero of World War I. The French army was surrendered, quote, to preserve it, to save it, to fight communism. There were very powerful pro-fascist movements in many of the countries that the Third Reich conquered, and many of those fascist movements were used as what were known as fifth column elements. And again, part and parcel to the entire thesis, the operating thesis of Radio Free America 37, is the strategic use of anti-communism, of the fear of communism, as a vehicle for conquest. We're going to begin this evening by once again jumping back to World War II, and we're going to take a look at a very important, though largely unknown book called The Nazis Go Underground. This was authored by an anti-fascist writer named Kurt Riess, R-I-E-S-S. It was copyrighted in 1944 and published in hardcover by Doubleday, Duran and Company. Kurt Riess was a very important anti-fascist writer whose work, unfortunately, like the works of so many of his contemporaries, were eclipsed, submerged during the McCarthy period. What we're going to look at now is a section of the chapter in The Nazis Go Underground called Those Who Paid Hitler. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the plans of the German industrialists and financiers who supported Adolf Hitler, and we're going to take a look at their plans to, quote, go underground, unquote, and to survive the Third Reich and to continue after the inevitable military defeat of Germany. Recall that last week we saw how the German general staff itself was preparing for what they saw as the inevitability of their own defeat by late 1941. With their failure to knock the Soviet Union out of the box, so to speak, in the first few months of their campaign, the German army had no plans to winter inside of the Soviet Union. By October of 1941, it was apparent to the German general staff they were not going to be able to do that. And then by December 9th of 1941, with the Japanese having attacked Pearl Harbor and the American entry into World War II against Germany as well as Japan inevitable, the German generals began planning for their defeat. The Nazi Party itself began planning for defeat in a formal way by the spring of 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad sealed the Third Reich's fate, even in the minds of the SS and Nazi loyalists. What we're going to look at today is how the industrialists and financiers who backed Hitler, and as we have looked at in numerous archive shows, had very strong connections with industrialists and financiers around the world under the auspices of cartel agreements, and it should be noted, too, that many of their business partners were also very sympathetic to fascism, which they saw as the antidote to Bolshevism, and not only the threat of the Soviet Union proper, but the very powerful socialist movements in other countries as well. With the Great Depression on, socialism gained a great deal of sympathy and political following, which would be difficult for people in the United States to imagine at this time. There were, it should be remembered, at the end of World War I, abortive socialist revolutions in not only Germany, but many of the other countries in Europe as well, Eastern Europe in particular. And with the establishment of the first Marxist state, namely the Soviet Union, many of the world's industrialists and financiers were in a state of panic, and they saw fascism as the ideal antidote to Bolshevism or Marxism or communism, as we have come to call it in the second half of the 20th century. It should be noted, too, that as I have emphasized so often, one cannot separate fascism, Nazism in particular, from multinational corporate capitalism. Although they are not coterminous, at the same time, in examining the real history of fascism, one cannot fail to note, as many writers, notably George Seldes and others, have noted, that it is inextricably linked with multinational corporate capitalism, American corporate capitalism in particular. Now, in the chapter Those Who Paid Hitler, we're going to examine now how the German industrialists planned to go underground and how they planned to preserve themselves after the inevitable Nazi defeat. Kurt Riess writes as follows: From a long-range point of view, the industrialists are in the same boat with the Nazis. They can't afford the luxury of throwing the fascists out. They must sink or swim together, because if the Nazis don't come back, the industrialists' dreams of world domination will be ended once and for all. And incidentally, business will never be so good as it used to be under Hitler. I would also interject at this point, one of the tenets of fascism has always been to crush unions and any form of labor organization as well. That obviously leads to greater profits. Continuing, what then can the German industrialists do to help the Nazis get back into power? They can go underground along with the Nazis. Of course, it is quite a different proposition for industry to go underground than for a party to do so. Perhaps it would be more exact to say that German industry from now on will have to lead a double life. This last sentence again for its key. Perhaps it would be more exact to say that German industry from now on will have to lead a double life. And the leading of that double life, as we shall see, led to the negotiations between Allen Dulles and German industrialists and financiers associated with the Canaris Group, as well as the Transatlantic Financial and Industrial Axis, which was central to the first two Radio Free America shows, Uncle Sam and the Swastika, etc. And again, those negotiations led to the Christian West concept, the seed concept for NATO. Continuing here. As far as the outside is concerned, or it should be here, there's a misprint. As far as the outside world is concerned, the industrialists will attend to their business and nothing else. But unofficially, they will go on collaborating with the outlawed Nazis. They will be very useful to the Nazi underground. They will find jobs for the many Nazis who must stay in Germany in order to attend to their subversive activities. They will find key positions for the key party men. They will finance the movement wherever and whenever it is necessary. In short, they will do for the Nazis exactly what they did for the nationalistic movements in the early 20s. All this may seem strange to a non-German observer, but German industrialists are strange men because they are obsessed men. A few days after the meeting at Krupp's residence, Herr von Schnitzler, S-C-H-N-I-T-Z-L-E-R, appeared in Madrid, having made the trip from Berlin in his own plane. He declared that he had escaped from Germany just ahead of the Gestapo, who were trying to arrest him. The statement was original, to say the least. For a man trying to escape from the Gestapo, Spain scarcely seemed a logical asylum. Switzerland or Sweden would have been much healthier places to repair to. And anyway, why should Herr von Schnitzler have had to fear the Gestapo, since his son-in-law, Herbert Schulz, was one of its leading officials? Schulz is S-C-H-O-L-Z. No, there is no reason to believe a word of what Baron Schnitzler said in those first interviews. I would interject at this point that von Schnitzler was one of the driving forces behind the IG Farben Chemical Company, the backbone not only of German war production, but also a key force in helping to finance the political rise of Adolf Hitler. Continuing. Schnitzler had always been rather popular, both nationally and internationally. After the Nazis came to power, it was frequently pointed out that the men in the IG Farben were not half so bad as the rest of the German industrialists, and decidedly not Nazis. Had Herr von Schnitzler not tried to keep his Jewish employees? And when he could do so no longer, had he not attempted to place them in IG Farben branches abroad? That was true. But it was also true that these Jews had made fortunes for IG Farben, and that it was good business to retain their services, and also made for international goodwill, which any German firm during the 30s could well use. It may be that Schnitzler himself never became a member of the party, and it is quite certain that his predecessor, Dr. Karl Duisberg, D-U-I-S-B-E-R-G, definitely disliked the Nazis. But the president of the company, Hermann Schmitz, had financed Hitler and had been a member of the party for a long time, a fact which, incidentally, his American and English business friends knew very well. So much for Schnitzler's background. As for his trip to Madrid in the spring of 1943, it had no connection at all with his being hunted by the Gestapo. But it did have everything to do with the post-war plans of German industry. Skipping down, George von Schnitzler did not stay very long in Madrid. 3 weeks after his, quote, flight, unquote, he was back in Berlin again. Somehow, he must have made his peace with the Gestapo. More important, his mission was completed. Before he went back to Germany, he made an appearance in Lisbon, too. He met a few friends there and familiarized them with certain, quote, changes of organization, unquote, which he said German industrialists were then contemplating. The details he gave showed how industry intended to carry through its plan of a faked divorce from Nazism. The last sentence again, the details he gave showed how industry intended to carry through its plan of a faked divorce from Nazism. To this end, von Schnitzler explained, German industry would fall back on its old, pre-Hitler organization. The most important of the organizations, in fact, the center around which all future activities would be organized, would be the Deutsche Weltwirtschaftliche Gesellschaft, the German World Economic Society. That's spelled D-E-U-T-S-C-H-E, capital W-E-L-T-W-I-R-T-S-C-H-A-F-T-L-I-C-H-E, G-E-S-E-L-L-S-C-H-A-F-T. Continuing. This society had been formed in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of World War I, with the idea of establishing a contact between leaders of German industry and industrial leaders abroad. It was born too late to be of any particular help during World War I. German industrialists remained isolated then, except for a few friends in neutral countries. And after the war, during the years of the Weimar Republic, it was hardly heard from. But this state of affairs changed completely after Hitler came to power. It was chiefly General Karl Haushofer, a member of the Society since 1930, who devised an active and provocative policy for the Society and mapped out ways and means of using it for propaganda and industrial espionage. It turned out to be relatively easy to do this because the Deutsche Weltwirtschaftliche Gesellschaft dominated the German representatives in the International Chamber of Commerce, which in turn provided intimate contacts with industrialists of other countries. Certain industrialists who were members of this society, among them Friedrich Krupp von Bohlen-Halbach, Otto Pietsch, and Dr. Otto Fischer, chief of the Reichskreditgesellschaft, had been very busy since the summer of 1943 trying to figure out what the Deutsche Weltwirtschaftliche Gesellschaft could do to reorganize business affairs and disconnect them from the Nazis. This, according to Herr von Schnitzler, would be accomplished by an outward divorce from the Nazi Party and by replacing all the Nazi machines of industry by those machines and organizations which had existed before Hitler came to power, all of which, it was thought, should certainly prove to benevolent bystanders that everything was again as it used to be before Hitler. By the way, spellings, von Bohlen-Halbach, Krupp, of course, is K-R-U-P-P, B-O-H-L-E-N H-A-L-B-A-C-H, Otto Pietsch is P-I-E-T-Z-S-C-H, and Fischer, F-I-S-C-H-E-R. Skipping down once again, the intricate business of international cartels being what it is next to impossible to find out with absolute certainty exactly how much the non-German business associates of German industrialists knew about these plans and to what degree they are willing to cooperate in them. Last sentence again. The intricate business of international cartels being what it is next to impossible to find out with absolute certainty exactly how much the non-German business associates of German industrialists know about these plans and to what degree they are willing to cooperate in them. Certain only are these facts. German industrialists have been working constantly on plans which permit them to go underground in the way described above, that is, to put up a false front behind which nothing will change, the entire project having been conceived in closest collaboration with leading Nazi personalities and for their benefit. Bear that in mind. We're going to touch back on that later in the broadcast. Herr von Schnitzler, and as we shall see later, other representatives of German industries as well, have at least attempted to make contacts with their former business associates abroad in order to propose a close collaboration and even a partnership for the post-war period. That last sentence again, and again I'm repeating this because these are in many ways thesis statements for what we're going to be looking at, and this book again was written in 1944. Herr von Schnitzler, and as we shall see later, other representatives of German industries as well have at least attempted to make contacts with their former business associates abroad in order to propose a close collaboration and even a partnership for the post-war period. To what degree this proposed collaboration is already an accomplished fact while the war is still being fought is anybody's guess. But would it matter whether this collaboration started yesterday or will start the day after the armistice? armistice, so far as giving aid and comfort to the Nazis is concerned. Well, what we're going to begin looking at now is the extent to which just exactly this type of negotiation described by Kurt Reese and the Nazis Go Underground was in fact well underway even before 1944, and as we shall see, this partnership and collaboration did in fact, that union was in fact formed in this period, and again it was this contact and this union between the Nazi industrialists and financiers and their American and British, American in particular, counterparts in this transatlantic industrial and financial axis, which gave rise to the Christian West concept, and as we shall see, that is the seed concept for what became NATO, the North Atlantic, Treaty Organization. We're now going to turn to an excellent book, one of the best books, in my opinion, ever written about the U.S. intelligence agencies, the U.S. intelligence system, and this book is excellent in particular because it goes into the connections between Wall Street and the fascist powers of Europe, Nazi Germany in particular, and it talks about how some of the main people involved in this transatlantic industrial and financial axis went on to become key operatives in the U.S. intelligence system, the CIA in particular, but also the Office of Strategic Services. This book goes into the Galen organization as well, and although it's very expensive, I would recommend it to any listener who is serious about studying not only the U.S. intelligence apparatus, but the history of the 20th century in general. This book is entitled The Old Boys, subtitled The American Elite and the Origins of the CIA. It was authored by Burton Hirsch, H-E-R-S-H, published in hardcover by Charles Scribner & Sons, New York, and it's copyrighted 1992. And again, it's an excellent read. I can't recommend this book too strongly. What we're going to begin looking at is one of the central figures in this particular installment of Radio Free America number 37, one of the most important figures in 20th century history and 20th century American history as well, a deeply evil individual, a person who fortunately is no longer with us physically, but an individual whose work, unfortunately, is still very much with us, or the result of it. That person is Allen Welch Dulles, a senior partner in Sullivan & Cromwell, one of the major foreign policy law firms on Wall Street, an individual who became head of the Bern, Switzerland OSS office during World War II, who later on went on to become director of the Central Intelligence Agency, while his brother, also a senior partner in Sullivan & Cromwell, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State. Allen Dulles later was fired by President Kennedy for lying to him about the Bay of Pigs. He then served on the Warren Commission, which was supposedly investigating President Kennedy's death. And the first thing we're going to look at, and by the way, the deep involvement of Sullivan and Cromwell and both Dulles brothers in this transatlantic industrial and financial axis, this was discussed at great length in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, which I play every Memorial Day weekend here on KFJC, and that archive show can be obtained from Archives on Audio. Of Allen Dulles and his views concerning Nazism, and we're talking here in 1932, Burton Hirsch writes as follows in The Old Boys. In May of 1932, Allen wrote Foster, that's Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, beginning again, in May of 1932, Allen wrote Foster that, quote, with the Prussian election, it seems to me that the question of the participation of the Hitler element in the Prussian government and then in the Reich government will again be agitated. Personally, I hope that their participation will be worked out, as I feel that any government in France would be very reluctant to enter into any far-reaching agreements with the German government which was not in some way underwritten or approved by the Hitler element, unquote. And that by way of indicating that not only was Allen Dulles and so many of the industrialists and financiers involved with the fascist powers of Europe from a business standpoint. For some of them it was just business. As the Germans say, Geheist ist Geheist, business is business. But many of them were also ardently pro-fascist because they saw fascism, again, as the antidote not only to the Marxist Soviet Union, but also to the threat of socialism in other countries as well. Skipping ahead, in the old boys, we're now going to look at a very important chapter called Buried Blissfully in Switzerland. Unfortunately, Allen Dulles was not buried in Switzerland. We all would be much better off if he had been literally buried in Switzerland or someplace else, but he was very much alive at this particular point in history and very active, and the effects of his activities are very much with us in calendar year 1992. The Donovan alluded to here is William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's World War II intelligence agency. Donovan himself, a very prominent Wall Street lawyer, involved with many of these same interests, notably the Morgan Group. Hirsch writes in this chapter, one find of Donovan's who regularly brought hackles up around the district, that's Washington, D.C., was his New York branch manager, Allen Dulles. By the way, branch manager here, it refers to OSS. It's not his New York branch manager. One find of Donovan's who regularly brought hackles up around the district was his New York branch manager, Allen Dulles. Eleanor Roosevelt would complain in a memo to FDR that Allen, a recurring personage in, quote, Bill Donovan's outfit, unquote, was, quote, closely tied up with the Schroeder Bank that is likely to be representative of the underground Nazi interests after the war, one of, quote, a great many people who are pretty close to the business side, unquote. Note here that Eleanor Roosevelt was noting Allen Dulles' connection to, among other Nazi interests, the Schroeder Bank that we looked at great length in the Uncle Sam and the Swastika broadcast from May of 1980. But as she notes here, the Schroeder Bank figures to become a major element in the post-World War II Nazi underground, whose formation was already obviously envisioned at that juncture. Now again, we just finished looking at Eleanor Roosevelt's prognostications concerning the role of the Schroeder Bank in the post-World War II Nazi underground and Allen Dulles' connections to that, among other Nazi business interests. What we're going to be looking at now are some of the activities of Allen Dulles while he was, quote, buried, unquote, in Switzerland. Again, Allen Dulles was head of the Bern, Switzerland office of the OSS, and that neutral country was the site of numerous negotiations being conducted by Allen Dulles and other representatives of the Western Allies with people from the Third Reich who were not only part and parcel to this transatlantic industrial and financial axis that I've been discussing for so long on this, or for so many years on this program, but who were also serving as not only diplomatic representatives but espionage agents for the Third Reich. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate something I discussed in the introduction of the broadcast. The Third Reich's national security establishment and intelligence system, just like our own intelligence system, was not monolithic. There were factions within it. One of the most important Third Reich intelligence agencies was the Abwehr, headed up for much of the war by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, last name Canaris. The Abwehr tended to be more identified with the traditional German officer corps, with the German aristocracy, and with the Junkers, the traditional German landholders. It obviously worked very closely with the more notorious elements of Nazism. At the same time, there were divisions within it. It should also be noted that the officer corps had many strategic differences with Adolf Hitler. Early on, the head of the Abwehr, the aforementioned Canaris, foresaw the defeat of the Third Reich. He also personally, according to accounts, was not necessarily contemptuous of, but quite horrified by certain aspects of the Third Reich, and partly because of that, but also largely to hedge his bets, because he foresaw early on the military defeat of the Third Reich coming. He had begun to make contact with the Great Britain and the United States through people who were at the same time diplomatic representatives and spies, and who at the same time were deeply immersed in the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that we're looking at here. It should also be noted that the world of espionage is, to say the least, murky. One thing I do not get too immersed in is the dynamic of what one could call spy versus spy. When it comes to the operation of double and triple agents, those are very murky waters indeed, and oftentimes the intelligence agencies themselves are not completely familiar with exactly who's working for who. And although many of these members of the Canaris group, again, part and parcel to some of the business interests which spanned the Atlantic and operated both in the United States as well as the Third Reich. Although many of them were making contact with the West, although many of them were channeling information to both the British and American intelligence services, many of them were also still functioning as spies for Nazi Germany, as well as touchdown points, feelers, for establishing exactly the kind of link between the German industrialists and financiers and their American and British counterparts, which the German industrialists sought to do in order to preserve their interests after World War II, as we shall see. As we looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, this was done, and we're going to take a look now at how representatives of the Canaris Group, part of this transatlantic axis, were in touch with Allen Dulles, and also how eventually these links between the, quote, German resistance, and this belongs in quotes here, they were plotting against Hitler, but only because they sought to preserve the Reich by ridding the Reich of some of the more notorious elements, i.e. Hitler and the SS, and the Germans, the Third Reich's prejudicial views. As we shall see, ultimately, this German underground, this, quote, resistance, unquote, and we should never lose sight of the quotes, their activities were well known to the SS and to Heinrich Himmler and to a man named Walter Schellenberg, who was in charge of Amt 6, the Bureau 6 of the Sicherheitsdienst. That's the SS intelligence service. Specifically, Schellenberg was in charge with foreign intelligence for the SD. They were aware of the activities of this, quote, resistance, unquote, associated with the Canaris Group. They also used some of the same people to effect direct contacts between representatives for the SS and people like Allen Dulles and the business interests that he represented. Now, the two most important names we're going to look at here are a fellow named Gero von Schulze-Gevernitz, that's spelled G-E-R-O, Schulze is S-C-H-U-L-Z-E, G-A-E-V-E-R-N-I-T-Z, and also a fellow called Prince von Hohenlohe. Specifically, Prince von Hohenlohe is spelled, or his full name is Prince Max Egon zu Hohenlohe-Langenburg. That's E-G-O-N-Z-U-H-O-H-E-L-O-H-E-L-A-N-G-E-N-B-U-R-G. Those are the two most important names. Gero von Gevernitz, a representative of the Canaris Group, also, though, an individual who effected contacts between representatives of the Sicherheitsdienst and the SS and Allen Dulles and the OSS. Now, von Hohenlohe was specifically a representative acting as a go-between between the SS and Allen Dulles and the interests he represented. Some other names you were going to want to pay attention here to. Again, the Schroeder banking interests. The Schroeder Bank, the Schroeder banking family was part and parcel to this transatlantic axis that I've been speaking about for so many years. They were British, American, and German branches of this. Take note of the Stinnes family. Hugo Stinnes was a major German industrialist and backer of Adolf Hitler who also had extensive holdings in the United States. He was touched on in Uncle Sam and the Swastika. Note also the Warburgs, again with German, British, and American branches. And we took a look at the Warburgs in connection with the I.G. Farben company, that in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, and an addendum to it that I did last Memorial Day. Also take note of a fellow named Edward von Waetjen, W-A-E-T-G-J-E-N, a German industrialist who married into the Rockefeller family. And as we shall see, Gero von Gevernitz and Allen Dulles had collaborated in setting up a company called Schildge Rumor, S-C-H-I-L-D-G-E, R-U-M-O-H-R, and this was financed. The financing for this was arranged by Allen Dulles through J. Henry Schroeder Company, and this was used by the Germans for circumventing the British blockade. Note also that Gero von Gevernitz, the friend of man, was involved with overseeing the Stinnes interests in Switzerland and Germany as well. And again, Hugo Stinnes, an ardent backer of Hitler and another main operative in this transatlantic industrial and financial axis. Waetjen and von Gevernitz served as Canaris men, again, representatives of the Abwehr, in making contact with and working with Allen Dulles, and this should all be seen against the background of the passage that we looked at from The Nazis Go Underground, in which the German industrialists sought to formally, at least, divorced themselves from Nazism, this by way of surviving the collapse of the Third Reich and maintaining their operations not only in Germany but around the world. And one of the central elements in that was to continue to operate with many of their cohorts in other countries such as Germany, or such as the United States and Britain. With Allen Dulles and his activities with Gero von Gewernitz and some of the other people that we're talking about, Burton Hirsch writes as follows in The Old Boys. Waiting for Dulles's arrival in Bern was Gero von Schulze-Gewernitz. Gewernitz represented a hybrid, the son of a liberal Quaker Reichstag politician whom Dulles met as early as 1916 and a sophisticated Jewish mother. The preceding generation's refinement came through in Gevernitz's distinctive widowspeak, his ready, deferential smile. Gero's sister married Edmund Stinnes, S-T-I-N-N-E-S, older son of the precocious Hitler backer and mega-capitalist Hugo Stinnes. Edmund had been excluded from the Stinnes Iron and Coal Combine and bided his time with academics on the Haverford faculty. By the way, Haverford College in Pennsylvania is a small, exclusive American undergraduate institution. As the 20s proceeded, Gewernitz jumped back and forth between the Ruhr and Wall Street. He acquired an economics doctorate and styled himself an, quote, investment counselor, unquote. Reinforced by his conciliatory manners, contacts from the Warburg Bank in Hamburg to the vaults of Basel, and impressive bilingualism, Gewernitz landed a job in Manhattan as an associate of the Equity Corporation. One of his fellows there was Ellery Huntington, Huntington, a confidant of Donovan's. Gewernitz maintained a close transatlantic association with the German financial expert Edward von Wechen, whose mother was American and himself married into a branch of the Rockefeller family. In 1936, Gewernitz took out U.S. citizenship papers. In 1939, Gevernitz's parents resettled in Switzerland. Gero, still in and out a great deal, now made his base in Bern, from where he watched over his brother-in-law's property near Ascona. When Allen Dulles appeared with a letter of introduction from Huntington, the gently spoken, beautifully brushed Gero, a bit past 40, impressed Dulles as ideally suited to function as his surrogate throughout the German-speaking emigre community. It is certainly conceivable that Dulles wasn't up to speed on Gevernitz's checkered involvements. Gero was a finagler by instinct, a high-style commission peddler. As late as October of 1941, Gewernitz, now bear in mind he was an American citizen at this point, as late as October of 1941, Gewernitz listed his occupation in Switzerland as an agent for Schilge Rumor Incorporated, a New York dummy corporation known subsequently as Transmares, Transmares, the financing for which Dulles himself had expedited through J. Henry Schroeder, and identified by the Department of Justice as a front for circumventing the British blockade with strategic materials for embattled Germany. Gero pocketed a 30,000 franc payoff from Maritime Suisse for inducing North German Lloyd to permit the cross-registration of a vessel from Finnish to Swiss flag, then sanitized the money in Lisbon through the notorious E.V.D. White, W-I-G-H-T. He continued to oversee Stinnes holdings in Germany and Switzerland. These involvements were obligatory, Gewernitz would explain to Dulles, quote, as additional cover for my trips to Germany and for my contacts with Germans, unquote. He required commercial bona fides to mask his services to British intelligence. Then, after war broke out, he rummaged widely at the behest of Brigadier General Barnwell Legge, L-E-G-G-E, the U.S. military attaché in Bern. Gewernitz had indeed rendered, Legge later wrote, quote, most valuable service by gaining contact with prominent German industrialists and businessmen who visited Switzerland. Now again, Gewernitz here, it should be recognized, was not just working with British and American intelligence services. It in fact appears that he was a triple agent, dispatched to Germany, or dispatched to Switzerland as a German diplomatic representative. He was spying for both U.S. and Britain, but he was apparently a triple agent because he was also spying for the Canaris Group. Continuing, Hirsch writes, whose agent was Gero? A confidential post-war memo refers to an interrogation of Dr. Wolfgang Krauel, K-R-A-U-E-L, until the Reich collapsed the German consul at Geneva. Crowell had unhesitatingly ticked off the roster of, quote, former Canaris men, unquote, in Switzerland. Hans Bernd Gisevius, Berndgisevius, Max von Engelbrechten, Engelbrechten, Graf Auersperg, Auersperg, von der Mühle, and it's not explained who his first name was, and specified that, quote, Canaris sent these men here to make contact with the Americans. They were ordered by Canaris to work through von Gebernitz. That last sentence again, all of these above men, and note here Hans Bernd Gisevius, Gisevius, very important name, we'll come back to him, but note here again, this from the former German consul at Geneva, quote, Canaris sent these men here to make contact with the Americans. They were ordered by Canaris to work through von Gebernitz. Canaris took this step because he early became pessimistic about the war's outcome. Eddie Vachin and Theodor Strunk, S-T-R-U-N-C-K, too joined the Canaris delegation in Switzerland. Years later, congratulating Dulles on his appointment as CIA director, an intimate of Canaris wrote Allen, quote, I have known since 1942 how highly Canaris esteemed you. Even at that time, Canaris ordered me to align myself with Dulles as soon as possible. I was also in touch with one of your most capable co-workers through a very clever banker. I was able to obtain from your staff without any difficulty some information very important for us. I would prefer to say nothing more about this now, unquote. So obviously these Canaris people, they were in contact with the Americans and British, and were also channeling the Americans and British some valuable information. There were divisions, and rather sharp ones, between the Canaris group and, say, the Sicherheitsdienst and the SS and Hitler and the more venal elements of the Nazi Party. Yet at the same time, what we're looking at here is a, quote, German resistance, which was in fact to form with their American counterparts, such as Allen Dulles, the Christian West concept, which is the seed concept for NATO, and which, as we shall see, permitted the survival of the more venal elements that Canaris himself was, at least up to a point, opposed to. And that permitted the survival, literally the survival of the Third Reich, although not in an overt territorial sense, and that is part and parcel to the overall thesis, how the U.S. lost the Second World War. So obviously this intimate of Canaris who wrote Allen Dulles is saying, I was able to obtain from your staff without any difficulty some information very important for us. I would prefer to say nothing more about this. Now, again, the whole question of double and triple agents is a very murky one, and these are waters that are very, very difficult to peer through. So exactly who is zooming who here is to a certain extent a matter of conjecture, and I doubt will ever be settled formally. But the important point here is to note the contacts between the Canaris group and Allen Dulles, the fact that the Canaris agents who were in touch with Dulles were part and parcel to the transatlantic industrial and financial axis, and as we shall see, this anti-Hitler, anti-SS, though pro-right group was, its existence was well known to the SS, to Heinrich Himmler, to Walter Schellenberg of the SD, and ultimately some of the same people such as von Gebernitz and Hans Bernd Gisevius were used to introduce Allen Dulles to Prince Max von Hohenlohe, who specifically was representing the SS, and this ultimately gave rise to the Christian West concept. Continuing here with Burton Hirsch's account. Messengers from the subtle, lisping little admiral who presided over German military intelligence, they came as envoys, confident of their welcome. Dulles's abiding link with what he subsequently dubbed the German underground was the chronically malcontented Hans Bernd Gisevius, that vast, floppy, wall-eyed Prussian handed along from rightist security expert Rudolf Diels to Hjalmar Schacht to the elusive Admiral Canaris himself. Diels is D-I-E-L-S. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht is S-C-H-A-C-H-T. His first name H-J-A-L-M-A-R. Continuing. A confirmed Stahlhelm reactionary with financial ties to the Lutheran Synod, quote, the fanaticism of Gisevius, unquote, proved instrumental, Brüning had warned Dulles, in subverting a decisive faction of the Nationalist Party between 1931 and 1933. Gisevius had hung on as a Gestapo lawyer before Canaris parked him as a vice consul in Zurich. So again, Gisevius, even though working for Canaris, is also SS. because the Gestapo was part of the SS. By the way, the SS hierarchy was grouped around what is known as the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. That is literally translates as the High Bureau of Reich Security. That was composed into two basic factions. One was the SD, or Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, and the other was the SIPO, or Sicherheitspolizei. SIPO is S-I-P-O. That in turn was divided into the KRIPO, K-R-I-P-O, or which was short for Kriminalpolizei, and the Gestapo, which was short for Geheime Staatspolizei, Secret State Police. So again, the RSHA divided into the SD and the SIPO, Security Police, and that in turn divided into the KRIPO and Gestapo. Continuing here. There, Canaris appointed Giuseppe as his representative to Madame Halina Zymanska, Halina Zymanska, the widowed Polish cutout through whom his military intelligence apparatus selectively leaked political insights to Vanden Heuvel and the SIS, that Special Intelligence Service. Dulles was soon sneaking the immense, baby-faced German into the drawing room at 23 Herrengasse, Herrengasse. They arrived at an understanding to keep the agile American up to date on the succession of plots on Hitler's life. Hopefully, through his purported access as, quote, President Roosevelt's personal representative, unquote, Dulles might benefit both their nations by conveying to Washington's ruling circles the settlement the insurgents were preparing to tender to the West. The last sentence again, because it's a key one. Hopefully, through his purported access as, quote, President Roosevelt's personal representative, unquote, Dulles might benefit both their nations by conveying to Washington's ruling circles the settlement the insurgents were preparing to tender the West. They'd viewed Dulles's portfolio as representative for the Enskilde Bank of Stockholm. They'd reviewed Dulles's portfolio as representation for the Enskilde Bank of Stockholm. Allen and his brother had argued for the Wallenbergs as late as 1940, when Marcus Wallenberg appeared in New York and attempted to immunize the American-held certificates of the Robert Bosch Company. Wallenberg is W-A-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G, and Bosch is B-O-S-C-H. Later on, Allen pleaded with Marcus to publicize at least a selective reference to, quote, your contacts and to my contacts with the resistance group prior to the July 20th putsch. Unless there are some local reasons at your end of which I cannot judge here, it might be well to get this out in the open a little more. One thing I would note is that the Wallenberg family, Marcus and Jakob Wallenberg, were head of the SKF. That was a giant ball bearing conglomerate, giant ball bearing manufacturer which supplied ball bearings to all sides, had a complete monopoly on ball bearing manufacture. During the Second World War, they supplied them to all of the major combatants. One thing I would note is that the Wallenberg family, Marcus and Jakob Wallenberg, were head of the SKF. That was a giant ball bearing conglomerate, giant ball bearing manufacturer which supplied ball bearings to all sides, had a complete monopoly on ball bearing manufacture. During the Second World War, they supplied them to all of the major combatants. Their commercial bank was the Enskilde Bank, although they were, shall we say, non-ideological in their business dealings. They were ardently pro-fascist, and there are substantive indications that the American representative for the Bright Company, one of their American firms, a fellow named William Batt, was the vehicle for betraying information about the U.S. Army Air Force raids on the enormous Schweinfurt ball-bearing facility at Regensburg in Germany. SKF owned that, and the American commander of that raid, and the American raiders were badly mauled by the Luftwaffe, said that the only way that that could have happened was if somebody had deliberately leaked the American plans. In the book Trading with the Enemy, Charles Hyam makes a very good case that, in fact, William Batt of the Bright Company was the vehicle for betraying the plans for the American raid on the Schweinfurt plant at Regensburg. And again, the American Army Air Force was badly mauled in those raids. Continuing here, again, the Wallenbergs are politely referred to here as ambivalent. Like the ambivalent Wallenbergs, Magneto King Robert Bosch, whose nephew was a principal inside the IG Farben leadership, covered quickly once prospects darkened. Quote, I had official information then, Dulles would divulge to a correspondent, which I subsequently confirmed that the Robert Bosch Company was used by Goerdler, that's Karl Goerdler, one of the plotters against Hitler, was used by Goerdler, Goerdeler, as a cover for many of his activities in connection with the organization of the German plots against Hitler, unquote. On official Reich passes, one heir to the vast Good Hope industrial empire, Alfred Haniel, Haniel, importuned Dulles in Bern repeatedly. Dulles's work at J. Henry Schroeder was appreciated, as was his closeness to Thomas McKittrick, M-C-K-I-T-T-R-I-C-K, Long Allen's legal client, currently president of the Bank of International Settlements. That, by the way, was in Switzerland. The BIS was originally a creature of German interests, which Hjalmar Schacht had set up to offload reparations responsibilities, and through the war years an invaluable clearinghouse for Third Reich prizes across Europe and abroad. Again, Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, who was part of this, again, part and parcel to this transatlantic axis that I've spoken about, he was the first finance minister of the Third Reich. He set up BIS, which to a large extent functioned as a useful vehicle for Third Reich financial and industrial interests. Continuing here with the old boys. Now again, bear in mind that so far what we've looked at are contacts between the Canaris group, again more aligned with the German officers, the industrialists, the German aristocracy, and the Junkers, and Allen Dulles. As we're going to see, these contacts and the plots against Hitler were well known to the SS, to Heinrich Himmler, and as we've seen, one of the main Canaris people was Hans Bernd Cassivius, and he was at the same time retained his rank in the SS, and he was a Gestapo lawyer. And we're going to see that these contacts between the Canaris people and Allen Dulles were manipulated by the SS to effect an introduction between Prince Max von Hohenlohe of the SS and Allen Dulles, and these negotiations, as well as the negotiations between the Canaris group and Allen Dulles, led directly to the Christian West concept. Continuing here, now here is where Burton Hirsch introduces the concept of the Christian West. Both Washington and London continued to discount the, quote, Christian West, unquote, approach Allen warmed to, which emphasized a coup against Hitler, his replacement by a government of nationalists free of the Nazis' hallucinated racism and counterproductive ethnic slaughter, military collaboration with the Anglo-Americans, and the continued holding of the Eastern Front, unquote, as this matter was touched on delicately in Dulles's careful editing of the official treatment of his sojourn in Bern. Again, the Christian West concept defined here. Both Washington and London continued to discount the Christian West approach Allen warmed to, which emphasized a coup against Hitler, his replacement by a government of nationalists free of the Nazis' hallucinated racism and counterproductive ethnic slaughter, military collaboration with the Anglo-Americans, and the, quote, continued holding of the Eastern Front, unquote, as this matter was touched on delicately in Dulles's careful editing of the official treatment of his sojourn in Bern. Quote, his superiors in Washington, the treatment stressed, advised him that it was unlikely a group of this size and character could exist clandestinely in Germany, unquote. The truth was, the plotters around Goerdler, codenamed Breakers by Dulles, and important figures in the Nazi government, and particularly the SS, were edging toward pretty much the same gloomy anticipations. Goerdler and his bumblers were permitted their antics precisely because important Nazi functionaries dismissed them as ineffectual, yet speculated that something helpful could yet emerge from their ill-disguised flounderings. Again, this last couple of sentences. The truth was, the plotters around Goerdler, codenamed Breakers by Dulles, and important figures in the Nazi government, and particularly the SS, were edging toward pretty much the same gloomy anticipations. Goerdler and his bumblers were permitted their antics precisely because important Nazi functionaries dismissed them as ineffectual, yet speculated that something helpful could yet emerge from their ill-disguised flounderings. Historians have regularly traced parallel peace initiatives by Abwehr activists and pessimistic SS officers. Often, there were distinctions emphasized which turned on very limited differences. Hans Cassivius, for example, had retained his rank as a Sonderführer in the SS. When the hesitant Himmler's liberal conduit to the bourgeois resistance, the lawyer Karl Langbehn, Langbehn, began to brew it about the possibility of an early, compromise peace throughout the neutral capitals, the sympathizer he usually dug out on his Swiss steps was Gero von Gewernitz. Interrupting here briefly, so Himmler, the person that Himmler used as his representative to the, quote, bourgeois resistance, unquote, this fellow Karl Langbehn used as his diplomatic introducer, so to speak, the person that he used to get to Dulles and to some of these same people who were in touch with Dulles was Gero von Gewernitz. Continuing. As early as the spring of 1939, Langbehn was visiting London regularly, he told his expatriated ex-law professor Fritz Pringsheim, quote, because he belonged to a strong wing in the Nazi Party which recommended an agreement with England, unquote. That's P-R-I-N-G-S-C-H-E-I-M. Skipping down, that's for Fritz Pringsheim. Langbehn's approaches to Gewernitz interested Walter Schellenberg, S-C-H-E-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G, especially. Within the SS, the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, looked after more sensitive matters like doctrine and subversion. As the SD's Amt 6 International Affairs Chief, Schellenberg amounted to foreign minister for the SS. He coveted the Abwehr's stagnating apparatus. How long could Canaris last? Schellenberg's bow lips and dark, insinuating glances had already won over the susceptible economics minister, Funk, F-U-N-K. Schellenberg honeycombed Funk's bureaucracy with commercial informers. Continuing here with Burton Hirsch's account. As early as the winter of 1942, Schellenberg hinted to the uneasy Himmler that he now intended to launch discreet soundings. These ranged from Abram Stevens Hewitt in Stockholm to Theodore Morde, M-O-R-D-E, a Reader's Digest correspondent in Ankara. Inevitably, Schellenberg discovered a go-between with lines to Dulles, and early in 1943, a series of discussions ensued. Thus opened the contested exchanges between, quote, Mr. Bull, unquote, Dulles, and Mr. Pauls, P-A-U-L-S, unquote, Prince Max Eugen zu Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Max Hohenlohe had long been an international set acquaintance of Dulles, a bustling, polished socialite from the Sudetenland whose status as a minor royal drew customers for munitions from the Skoda Works, a concession Schellenberg helped him snag. Hohenlohe already bestowed over vast landed properties in Spain after marrying into the Habsburg family. He was currently hedging his political future by traveling on a Liechtensteinian passport. A Canaris familiar, Prince Hohenlohe, caught Schellenberg's attention early in 1942 by sending the rising SD official his own jaundiced appraisal of prospects in Europe. With the all-seeing SD commander Reinhard Heydrich assassinated at the end of May, possibilities had obviously widened for the opportunistic Schellenberg. Barely 30, scarcely beyond his baby fat, the Amt 6 chieftain resembled an SS doll decked out in death's head campaign hat and tailored parade uniform. With Schellenberg's cautious sponsorship, Max Hohenlohe trotted out a line of provisional peace proposals, first with the British ambassador Sir Samuel Hoare, H-O-A-R-E, always a soft touch, and the sympathetic American counselor of embassy William Walton Butterworth, an intimate of George Kennan since Princeton, with Vatican sympathizers with Fritz Klein, K-L-E-I-N, a friend of both the Dulles brothers, and, evidently at the recommendation of American negotiators in Lisbon, where Kennan and Colonel Solberg were stationed with Allen Dulles himself toward the middle of February 1943. Solberg is S-O-L-B-O-R-G. So again, Solberg, himself a member of the European royalty, even the Habsburgs, is acting here as a representative, long also an acquaintance of Allen Dulles, deeply involved with the overseeing of various industrial properties under the Third Reich's auspices, such as the Skoda munitions works in Czechoslovakia. Max Hohenlohe here is dealing with Allen Dulles as a representative of Walter Schellenberg, head of the SD, and as Burton Hirsch has noted here, for all intents and purposes, the foreign minister of the SS. And now we're going to see what came out of these particular negotiations. This represents the Christian West concept again, and as we shall see, that it was the seed concept for NATO, although it did not happen through a coup against Adolf Hitler. That coup on July 20th was unsuccessful. It did happen after the formal collapse of the Third Reich. And recall that last week we looked at the possibility that the Western Front may have been deliberately opened. Well, it'll be never known for sure, but with the capturing of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen under very strange circumstances, it may be that the negotiations being undertaken by the Germans with the OSS under Vatican auspices were successful, and that the front was in fact, the Western Front, thrown open to the Anglo-American armies to permit them to occupy most of Germany. We'll never know about that. But in any event, now we're going to take a look at what the substance was of the negotiations between Max von Hohenlohe, representing Schellenberg and the SS and the SD, and Allen Dulles. Exactly what was agreed upon has become a matter of dispute, largely because the SS summations of the exchanges appear to have passed through Russian hands on their way to the archives, after which the USSR news services waited until 1948 and the upheavals of the Cold War to put them out as dispatches. Nevertheless, much of their thrust is borne out by related RSHA paperwork, private journals, and intelligence files from a variety of sources. The last sentence again, nevertheless, much of their thrust is borne out by related RSHA paperwork, private journals, and intelligence files from a variety of sources. What seemed most scandalous at the time was Dulles's reported pique with, quote, outdated politicians, emigres, and prejudiced Jews, unquote. The hope in America was that these malcontents could be resettled perhaps in, quote, Africa, unquote. Bear in mind, this is Allen Dulles here. As one in close touch with Vatican circles, Dulles maintained he strongly urged the German bishops to, quote, plead Germany's cause, unquote, in America, keeping in mind that it, quote, it had been the American Catholics who forced the Jewish American papers to stop their baiting of Franco's Spain, unquote. Once again, this isn't Hitler talking, this is Allen Dulles, regrettably not nearly the difference between the two one might have hoped. Now, again, we're about to come to the real substance of what it was that Freudian slip, Dulles and von Hohenlohe were putting together here. Hirsch continues, this has the look of crumbs spread upon the water. Pronouncements alternated with rich meals in a Liechtenstein chateau. Hohenlohe, bit by bit, exposed his quasi-official status as a spokesman for SS elements within the German government who now looked beyond the, quote, wild men, unquote, in control. What casts a longer shadow is the outline of Allen's geopolitical ideas. The peace he has in mind, Dulles indicates, must avoid the excesses of Versailles and permit the expanded German polity to survive, Austria included, and possibly at least a section of Czechoslovakia, while excluding all thought of, quote, victors and vanquished as a factor of order and progress, unquote. Within this decentralized nation, the importance of Prussia must be reduced to ward off for the future, Dulles is quoted directly here, the, quote, inwardly unbalanced, inferiority complex-ridden Prussian militarism, unquote. The resultant, quote, greater Germany, unquote, would backstop the, quote, formation of a cordon sanitaire against Bolshevism and Pan-Slavism through the eastward enlargement of Poland and the preservation of a strong Hungary, unquote. This, quote, federal Greater Germany, similar to the United States, with an associated Danube Confederation, would be the best guarantee of order and progress in Central and Eastern Europe. So, again, this is not Hitler talking here. That's Allen Dulles proposing that a Greater Germany would be the best bulwark against the expansion of Bolshevism. Initially, of course, due to the military outcome of World War II, such a Greater Germany was not to take place. But again, one it doesn't require a great deal of imagination to see the obvious relationship here between the Christian West concept that was formulated by both these German diplomatic and espionage people, first the Canaris people and then Hohenlohe representing the SS. And bear in mind that, as we looked at last week in the Nazis Go Underground, the core of the underground Nazi apparatus was indeed to be the SS and Gestapo. That is who Max von Hohenlohe was representing here. It's at the present historical distance, though, as we look back from 1992, it is not hard to see the ultimate realization of such a greater Germany. This past spring, I did an archive show called The Old Germany and the New Nazis, or The New Germany and the Old Nazis, excuse me, and read a paper by Martin Lee, a well-known author in this field. He's writing a book about Germany and the resurgence of Nazism in Germany, and in official pronouncements of the current German government, the former East Germany is referred to as Middle Germany. Well, if the former East Germany is Middle Germany, what would Eastern Germany be? I don't think it requires a great deal of imagination. That here is contained in this particular concept here. The eastward enlargement of Poland, the preservation of a strong Hungary, a Danube confederation, and a section of Czechoslovakia. It's kind of what we're looking at here. I would note also that Slovakia, there is no more Czechoslovakia. Slovakia is now an independent state, as it was under the Nazi puppet Josef Tiso, the Reverend Josef Tiso. We looked at that in Radio Free America number 36, the destabilization of the USSR and Eastern Europe. But again, the Christian West concept did not come about through a coup against Adolf Hitler. There was a coup, it was unsuccessful, but after World War II, the Christian West concept, Anglo-American military collaboration with Germany, a strong Germany as a bulwark in Central Europe against the expansion of Bolshevism, and the incorporation of significant elements of the Third Reich into this, that is the basic seed for NATO. And as we're going to look at over the course of the development of RFA 37, at the core of NATO was the Gehlen spy organization. That turned out to be a Trojan horse as far as the United States was concerned, an organization which is one of the most misunderstood factors in world history. In my opinion, and I'll go to the mat with anyone on this, it is arguably the most important political and military organization of the second half of the 20th century, perhaps the entire century as a whole. Skipping down now, before we take a musical break, skipping down now, in The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch, more about the Christian West concept. An Abwehr officer, F. Justus von Einem, E-I-N-E-M, later claimed to have sat in on a carefully prepared meeting at Santander in Spain in the summer of 1943, during which both Menzies and Donovan agreed to Christian Western terms as recapitulated by Canaris personally. If this exchange occurred, Donovan kept it quiet. Menzies was a British diplomat as well. So the Christian West concept ultimately did give rise directly to NATO. It's not identical, but it did give rise directly to NATO after the formal conclusion of the hostilities of World War II, and as we will see later, and later this week, and also next week as well, with the Gehlen organization specifically incorporating large elements of the SS and Gestapo, that was at the center of NATO, and the Christian West turned out to be none too Christian after all. We're going to take a look at an article by Carl Oglesby in Covert Action Information Bulletin's issue number 35, in which he examines the Gehlen organization and specifically examines it in an historical light that I think is absolutely accurate, although it will certainly prove very controversial. He views the Gehlen organization as an extension of the Odessa and as a Trojan horse in the United States. We're going to be taking a look at Carl Oglesby's article from Covert Action Information Bulletin, and we're also going to take a look at the role of Gero von Gebernitz in leading to the formation of the Gehlen organization. All of that coming up after a musical break in the next installment of Radio Free America number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. We're going to continue now with the next section of tonight's installment of Radio Free America number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. Now recall that what we've looked at so far was the plans of the German industrialists to formally effect a break from Hitler and to resume contact, although as we've seen, contact between these German industrialists and financiers and their American and British counterparts, that contact was never really broken. But they plan to resume, to use the international cartel connections, actually that's redundant, the cartel connections, to help to preserve their interests after the Second World War, to, in essence, establish a post-Hitler Reich. And we've taken a look at how Allen Dulles, a key American member of the transatlantic industrial and financial axis, as the Bern, Switzerland representative of OSS, was in touch with other members of this transatlantic financial and industrial axis. These were Germans, or in some cases German Americans. The main name is Gero von Gebernitz. How many of these people were in Switzerland in touch with Dulles as representatives of the Canaris Group, and how ultimately the negotiations between the Canaris Group and Allen Dulles and the Christian West concept, which they were working on to establish a coup against Hitler and establish Anglo-American German military cooperation and to hold the front against the Soviet Union. Ultimately, these negotiations led to negotiations between Max von Hohenlohe, Prince von Hohenlohe, a representative of the SS, being dispatched by Walter Schellenberg, head of Amt 6 of the Sicherheitsdienst, and how the Christian West concept was then formalized between von Hohenlohe as representative of the SS and Allen Dulles as representative of American corporate interests and, quote, Roosevelt's personal representative. What we're going to be looking at now is the formation of the Gehlen Organization. Again, the main names to remember, in addition to von Hohenlohe, are Gero von Gebernitz, who was working with Dulles as a member of the Canaris Group, channeling information, espionage information, to the British and Americans, but also, as we've seen, functioning as a triple agent and channeling information back to the Third Reich. Gero von Gebernitz is a name we're going to come back to later. Also remember the name Hans Bernd Gesivius, who was one of the Canaris people in touch with Dulles through von Gebernitz on behalf of Canaris. Also, as we have seen, though, he retained his rank in the SS, another individual who is central to these negotiations. And as we've seen, even though there was never a successful plot against Adolf Hitler, the Christian West concept is basically the seed concept for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What we're going to look at now is how the Reinhard Gehlen Organization, the Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit, came to be at the center of NATO, its pivotal influence in both the United States and Germany, and the influence it wielded on NATO and the Cold War. We're specifically going to look at how the Gehlen Organization influenced the United States next week. We're going to begin looking at the Gehlen Organization now and how at the center of the Christian West concept was a most un-Christian organization, because the Gehlen Organization, as we shall see to a large extent, represented a wing of the Odessa, the post-World War II SS underground. There were thousands of very important SS and Gestapo people in the Gehlen Organization, and it should be recalled, as we've looked at in other broadcasts in the past, at the core of the SS philosophy was an occult, a pan-German occult philosophy, which was anything but Christian. Certainly their behavior, as recorded by history, was anything but Christian. It should be recalled, though, that at the core of the SS philosophy was an occultism which was deeply alien to the fundamentals of Christianity. By the way, I'm not a practicing Christian. Recall that one of the things that we've looked at in the past was that the SS Oath of Allegiance was a passage from Goethe which translated was the Lord's Prayer backwards. That is a so-called black mass. What we're going to be looking at now, again, is the Gehlen Organization, how it began to function, or at least in the view of Carl Oglesby, and it's the view I subscribe to, how it began to function as a wing of the Odessa. And as we shall see, the Gehlen Organization literally functioned as a Trojan horse inside of the United States. It should be recalled that one of the statements, and I'll touch on this again in the future, one of the key statements in Kurt Riess's The Nazis Go Underground was that the exact nature of the post-World War II Nazi underground would be determined by political conditions at the time. The advent of nuclear weapons basically precluded the possibility of overt, broad frontal warfare of the kind that we saw in the world wars. With the threat of mutually assured destruction, it was no longer possible to send whole army groups crashing across an enemy's border. So the function of espionage and covert action in the nuclear age has been greatly magnified. What has come to be known as low-intensity warfare or covert operation replaced broad frontal warfare as the main vehicle for international conflict. And as we have seen in other archives in the past, notably Radio Free America shows 1, 2, and 3, dealing with the Galen Organization, programs 14 and 15, and Radio Free America program number 36. Also, Radio Free America 22 dealt extensively with Galen. Radio Free America program number 36, the destabilization of the USSR and Eastern Europe, also featured the Galen Organization and related elements prominently. What we're going to take a look at now is the Galen Organization and how it came to be at the apex of the, quote, Christian West, unquote, concept, which was formulated by both German and American and British representatives of this transatlantic financial and industrial axis that we're looking at. Again, the Christian West concept was the seed concept for NATO. What we're going to look at now is an article from Covert Action Information Bulletin's issue number 35 from the fall of 1990. This article is called Reinhard Galen, The Secret Treaty of Fort Hunt. It's by author Carl Oglesby, last name Oglesby. By the way, I would strongly recommend that people subscribe to Covert Action Information Bulletin. It's a quarterly and is the best periodical about the functioning of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. Also, you can order back issues from Covert Action. The address is Covert Action Information Bulletin, 1500 Massachusetts Avenue, Northwest, number 732. That's in Washington, D.C., 20005. Once again, Covert Action Information Bulletin, 1500 Massachusetts Avenue, Northwest, number 732. That's in Washington, D.C., 20005. And you can, in addition to subscribing, as I said, you can also order back issues of CAIB. We're going to proceed now with a reading and analysis of Oglesby's article. Oglesby begins, William Shirer closed his 1960 masterpiece, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, with the judgment that the Nazi regime, quote, had passed into history, unquote. But we cannot be so confident today. On the contrary, the evidence as of 1990 is that World War II did not end as Shirer believed it did, that Nazism did not surrender unconditionally and disappear, that indeed it finessed a limited but crucial victory over the Allies, a victory no less significant for having been kept a secret from all but the few Americans who were directly involved. The next section of Oglesby's article after the introduction is called The Odessa and Its Mission. Hitler continued to rant of victory, but after Germany's massive defeat in the Battle of Stalingrad in mid-January of 1943, the realists of the German General Staff, OKW, were all agreed that their game was lost. Defeat at Stalingrad meant at a minimum that Germany could not win the war in the East that year. This, in turn, meant that the Nazis would have to keep the great preponderance of their military forces tied down on the Eastern Front and could not redeploy them to the West, where the Anglo-American invasion of Italy would occur that summer. Apparently inspired by the Soviet victory, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced at Casablanca on January 24, 1943, their demand for Germany's unconditional surrender and the complete denazification of Europe. Within the German General Staff, two competing groups formed around the question of what to do, one led by Heinrich Himmler, the other by Martin Bormann. Himmler was chief of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or protective echelon, the black-shirted core of the Nazi Party that emerged as Hitler's bodyguard in the late 1920s and grew into the most powerful of the Nazi political institutions. After the failure of the attempted military coup of July 20, 1944, which wounded but did not kill Hitler, the SS seized all power and imposed a furious blood purge of the armed services in which some 7,000 were arrested and nearly 5,000 executed. The SS was at that point the only organ of the Nazi state. Himmler's plan for dealing with the grim situation facing Nazism found its premise in Hitler's belief that the alliance between, quote, the ultra-capitalists, unquote, of the U.S. and, quote, the ultra-Marxists, unquote, of the Soviet Union was politically unstable. Quote, even now they are at loggerheads, unquote, said Hitler, again quoting, If we can now deliver a few more blows, this artificially bolstered common front may suddenly collapse with a giant clap of thunder," unquote. Himmler believed that this collapse would occur and that the U.S. would then consider the formation of a new anti-Soviet alliance with Nazi Germany. The Nazis would then negotiate, quote, "a separate peace," unquote, with the United States, separate from any peace with the USSR, with which Germany would remain at war, now joined against the Soviets by the United States. But Martin Bormann, who was even more powerful than Himmler, did not accept the premise of the separate peace idea. Bormann was an intimate of Hitler's, the deputy Führer and head of the Nazi Party, thus superior to Himmler in rank. Bormann wielded additional power as Hitler's link to the industrial and financial cartels that ran the Nazi economy, and was particularly close to Hermann Schmitz, chief executive of IG Farben, the giant chemical firm that was Nazi Germany's greatest industrial power. With the support of Schmitz, Bormann rejected Himmler's separate peace strategy on the ground that it was far too optimistic. The Allied military advantage was too great, Bormann believed, for Roosevelt to be talked into a separate peace. Roosevelt, after all, had taken the lead in proclaiming the Allies' demand for Germany's unconditional surrender and total denazification. Bormann reasoned rather that the Nazis' best hope of surviving military defeat lay within their own resources, chief of which was the cohesion of tens of thousands of SS men for whom the prospect of surrender could offer only the gallows. Bormann and Schmitz developed a more aggressive, self-contained approach to the problem of the looming military defeat, the central concept of which was that large numbers of Nazis would have to leave Europe and, at least for a time, find places in the world in which to recover their strength. There were several possibilities in Latin America, most notably Argentina and Paraguay, South Africa, Egypt, and Indonesia were also attractive areas in which to retreat, attractive rear areas in which to retreat. After the German defeat in the Battle of Normandy in June of 1944, Bormann took the first external steps toward implementing concrete plans for the Nazis' great escape. An enormous amount of Nazi treasure had to be moved out of Europe and made safe. This treasure was apparently divided into several caches, of which the one at the Reichsbank in Berlin included almost 3 tons of gold, much of it the so-called tooth gold from the slaughter camps, as well as silver, platinum, tens of thousands of carats of precious stones, and perhaps $1 billion in various currencies. There were industrial assets to be expatriated, including large tonnages of specialty steel and certain industrial machinery, as well as blueprints critical to the domination of certain areas of manufacturing. Key Nazi companies needed to be relicensed outside Germany in order to escape the reach of war reparations claims, and tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals, almost all of them members of the SS, needed help to escape Germany and safely regroup in foreign colonies capable of providing security and livelihoods. For help with the first 3 of these tasks, Bormann convened a secret meeting of key German industrialists on August 10, 1944, at the Hotel Maison Rouge in Strasbourg. One part of the minutes of this meeting states, quote, "The Nazi Party is ready to supply large amounts of money to these industrialists who contribute to the post-war organization abroad. In return, the party demands all financial reserves which have already been transferred abroad or may later be transferred, so that after the defeat, a strong new Reich can be built." The Nazi expert in this area was Hitler's one-time financial genius and Minister of the Economy, Dr. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, available to Bormann even though he was in prison on suspicion of involvement in the anti-Hitler coup of 1944. According to a U.S. Treasury Department report of 1945, at least 750 enterprises financed by the Nazi Party had been set up outside Germany by the end of the war. These firms were capable of generating an annual income of approximately $30 million, all of it available to Nazi causes. It was Schacht's ability to finesse the legalities of licensing and ownership that brought the situation about. Organizing the physical removal of the Nazis' material assets and the escape of SS personnel were the tasks of the hulking Otto Skorzeny, S-K-O-R-Z-E-N-Y, simultaneously an officer of the SS, the Gestapo, and the Waffen-SS, as well as Hitler's favorite commando. Skorzeny worked closely with Bormann and Schacht in transporting the Nazi assets to safety outside Europe and in creating a network of SS escape routes, or rat lines, that led from all over Germany to the Bavarian city of Memmingen, then to Rome, then by sea to a number of Nazi retreat colonies set up in the global south. The international organization created to accommodate Bormann's plans is most often called the Odessa, a German acronym for, quote, Organization of Veterans of the SS, unquote. It has remained active as a shadowy presence since the war, and may indeed constitute Nazism's most notable organizational achievement. But we must understand that none of Bormann's, Skorzany's, and Schacht's well-laid plans would have stood the least chance of succeeding had it not been for a final component of their organization, one not usually associated with the Odessa at all, but very possibly the linchpin of the entire project. Let's pause to take a look at what we've seen so far in this section. First of all, again, Oglesby makes the point, and I think it is a valid one, that Germany finessed a limited victory over the United States, and we're going to come to see how that happened in weeks to come. We've already taken a look at the pivotal role of Gehlen and Gehlen-related elements in the assassination of John Kennedy, functioning as part of an explicitly fascist milieu in cooperation with the American far right, such as elements of the John Birch Society associated with the Hunt family. We have also taken a look at the intersection between this milieu and the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and we will also take a look at how the broader aspects of this particular milieu as well. And bear in mind that this milieu is directly connected to mainstream American politics. George Bush is part and parcel to this particular milieu. Now, bear in mind again that the Nazis had the Third Reich had long envisioned its military victory well before 1944 or 1945. As we've looked at earlier, the German generals were planning to make provisions for defeat from 1941 on, the Nazi Party proper from 1943 on. Now, note, too, that there were two distinct approaches, at least as analyzed by Oglesby here, to how to conduct the going underground of the Nazi Party. Bear in mind that Himmler favored Hitler's separate peace proposal. That did not happen during the course of the military war, but as we've seen, the Christian West concept was essentially what Hitler and Himmler were aiming at in that particular attitude toward defeat and towards resurgence of the Reich. As we've seen, the Christian West concept was one which was central to the transatlantic industrial and financial axis that we've been looking at and that we've looked at for so many years here on this program, and that the Christian West concept was the seed concept for NATO. I would also note the Martin Bormann approach, which involved the forging together of German industrialists and financiers, those involved around the cartels, which also obviously involved large elements of American industry and finance, and the fusing together of these industrialists and financiers and the Nazi Party to finance Nazi activities abroad. Obviously, the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that we've spoken about was part and parcel to the German financial cartels and the fusing together of German industry and finance with the Nazi Party, and that happened. Obviously placed Nazism per se directly into this milieu, the German Nazi Party per se. Obviously, this milieu had been, this transatlantic financial and industrial axis had been deeply involved with helping to arm and finance the Third Reich. Many of its participants, such as Allen Dulles, were also basically of pro-Axis sympathies. And again, we're not going to go into the Latin American operations of the post-World War II Nazi underground later on, and as I update some current stories, we're going to get to touch on that. But do take note of the fact, and this is well documented, that a U.S. Treasury Department report said that there were more than 750 companies that were formed by the Nazi Party and operating abroad. This is something that has never been properly accounted for, and unfortunately it's something that's very much with us today. Continuing now with the next section of Oglesby's article, entitled Enter Gehlen, it begins, "This final element of the Odessa was the so-called Gehlen organization, the Org, the Nazi intelligence system that sold itself to the U.S. at the end of the war. It was by far the most audacious, most critical, and most essential part of the entire Odessa undertaking. The literature on the Odessa and that on the Gehlen organization, however, are two different things. No writer in the field of Nazi studies has yet explicitly associated the two, despite the fact that General Reinhard Gehlen was tied politically as well as personally with Skorzeny and Schacht. Moreover, Gehlen's fabled post-war organization was in large part staffed by SS Nazis who were positively identified with the Odessa, men such as the infamous Franz Alfred Sieks and Emil Augsburg of the Wannsee Institute. Wannsee is W-A-N-N-S-E-E. Sieks and Augsburg were discussed in Radio Free America number 2 at considerable length. By the way, I would also note that in Radio Free America number 3, which I did in June of 1984, I made the equation of the Gehlen organization with the Odessa. That's the same basic thesis that 6 years later Carl Oglesby is presenting, and I'm reading it to you 2 years after he presented it. But those of you who are interested can get a hold of the archives, and specifically Radio Free America number 3 from June of 1984. I made this equation at this time. Continuing. An even more compelling reason for associating Gehlen with the Odessa is that without his organization as a screen, the various Odessa projects would have been directly exposed to American intelligence. If the Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, and the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, had not been neutralized by the Gehlen ploy, the Odessa's great escape scheme would have been discovered and broken up. At 43, Brigadier General Reinhard Gehlen was a stiff, unpossessing man of 5 foot 8.5 inches and 128 pounds when he presented himself for surrender at the U.S. Command Center at Fischhausen. That's F-I-S-C-H-H-A-U-S-E-N. But there was nothing small about his ego. Quote, "I am head of the section Foreign Armies East in German Army Headquarters," unquote, he announced to the GI at the desk. Again quoting, "I have information to give of the highest importance to your government," unquote. The GI was not impressed, however, and Gehlen spent weeks stewing in a POW compound before an evident Soviet eagerness to find him finally aroused the Americans' attention. Gehlen became chief of the Third Reich's Foreign Armies East, or FHO, on April 1st, 1942. He was thus responsible for Germany's military intelligence operations throughout East Europe and the Soviet Union. His FHO was connected in this role with a number of secret fascist organizations in the countries to Germany's east. These included Stefan Bandera's B faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUNB, Romania's Iron Guard, the Ustashi of Yugoslavia, the Vanagis, V-A-N-A-G-I-S of Latvia, and after the summer of 1942, Vlasov's Army, the band of defectors from Soviet communism marching behind former Red hero General Andrei Vlasov. Later on in the war, Gehlen placed one of his top men in control of Foreign Armies West, which broadened his power, and then after Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was purged and his Abwehr intelligence service cannibalized by the SS, Gehlen became in effect Nazi Germany's overall top intelligence official. I'm going to pause at this particular point, and I'm going to read you a couple of sections actually, from a book about Gehlen that we dealt with in our first 2 Radio Free America shows. This particular book is called "The General Was a Spy," subtitled "The Truth About General Gehlen and His Spy Ring." It's co-authored by Heinz Höhne and Hermann Zolling. Höhne is H-O-H-N-E. Hermann Zolling is Z-O-L-L-I-N-G. It's published in hardcover by Coward, McCann, and Goffin Incorporated. It's G-E-O-G-H-E-G-A-N. And it's copyrighted 1971. And what we're going to look at here is the close collaboration between Reinhard Gehlen and the RSHA, the Central Bureau of the SS that I spoke about earlier, and in particular, take note not only of Gehlen's close connection to the RSHA, but his connections with the aforementioned Walter Schellenberg, head of Amt 6 of the Sicherheitsdienst. Basically, that was the International Affairs section of the SS Intelligence Service. It was Schellenberg who was aware of the, quote, resistance people grouped around the German industrialists, some of whom were dispatched by Canaris to deal with Allen Dulles, and recalled that the SS and other Nazi functionaries were aware of the plotting against Hitler. They let it go on because it was deemed to be politically useful, and ultimately the Canaris links to Allen Dulles that were established by people like Gero von Gebernitz and others, including Hans Bernd Gesivius, who himself retained rank in the SS. Ultimately, those contacts between Canaris people and Allen Dulles led to the connection that led to the contact between Prince Max von Hohenlohe and Allen Dulles, and von Hohenlohe, dispatched by Schellenberg, was specifically an emissary of the SS, and recall that's where more of the Christian West concept was hammered out. And as we've seen again, the Christian West concept formed by members of this transatlantic industrial and financial axis involved with both Allied and Third Reich intelligence during the war was the basic seed concept out of which NATO grew. But here, take note, in The General Was a Spy, of the close links between Schellenberg and the RSHA and Gehlen. Reading now from The General Was a Spy, Höhne and Zolling write, Gehlen succeeded in establishing even closer links with Hermann Bahn and Schmalzlager, that's Schmalschlager, umlaut Ger. Schellenberg raised no objection to Volley 1 and 3 remaining entirely subordinate to FHO, quote, from the military point of view, unquote. FHO is Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East. Continuing, they retained their old titles until the very end of the war, and the SS designations never became the rule. In fact, the RSHA was only too happy to let Gehlen go his own way, for even the SD recognized the value of FHO's work. Colonel Gehlen became an increasingly close and indispensable partner of the RSHA. What is the explanation of this mystery? The defenders of Gehlen prefer to leave it unexplained, for close collaboration between RSHA and FHO stands in glaring contrast to the picture which his admirers like to draw of the role he played in the final phase of the Third Reich. The first president of the BND likes to present himself as a resistance fighter, or at least as opposed to the Nazi state. That, of course, is absolute poppycock. We've looked at that in the past. Going back to The General Was a Spy, more about the contact between the RSHA and the FHO under Gehlen, and bear in mind that Walter Schellenberg was deeply involved with Reinhard Gehlen. Cooperation between FHO and the RSHA became increasingly close, and relations between Gehlen and the SD officers increasingly intimate. Consultation with FHO on their manifold subversive activities became a matter of routine to the SD. Whether they wanted information on Soviet partisans, investigations into adherents of the Free Germany Committee formed by German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union, or evaluation of intelligence received by the SD from foreign intelligence services, the FHO was always on hand to enlighten its SS comrades. FHO's information was in fact so useful that the RSHA gave almost ungrudging recognition to the work of Gehlen's section. When he visited FHO headquarters, Schellenberg flattered his host Gehlen, saying that the SD would never be able to work with the scientific precision of FHO. And still later, Gehlen ultimately became so close an ally of the RSHA that during the death throes of Adolf Hitler's regime, he, together with the SS officers Skorzeny and Kreutzmann, was charged with military direction of that macabre partisan and resistance organization known as, quote, werewolf, unquote, intended to spread panic among the enemy. Kreutzmann, by the way, P-R-U umlaut T-Z-M-A-N-N. So again, Gehlen was very close to RSHA and Walter Schellenberg, and it was Schellenberg who dispatched Prince von Hohenlohe on behalf of the SS to negotiate with Allen Dulles. The Christian West concept was further developed after that. And bear in mind that as we looked at last week in The Nazis Go Underground, it was the SS and the Gestapo that were to form the core of the post-World War II Nazi underground. Continuing now with Carl Oglesby's article from Covert Action Information Bulletin, number 35 in the fall of 1990. Now bear in mind, too, one of the concepts I introduced last week, and that was one of the main theoretical and operational considerations of the Third Reich, both when it was a nascent political movement in Weimar Germany and when it became the dominant world power that it did, and after it was supposedly dissolved, really the word is eclipsed here, at the end of the formal conclusion to World War II. Bear in mind that at the German General Staff, the Nazi Party, and also the industrialists and financiers allied with them, learned to use anti-communism, the fear of communism, as a major strategic tool for their own aims of conquest and preservation. That's central to the entire thesis of Radio Free America 37. Now we're going to return to Carl Oglesby's article. In December of 1943, at the latest, Galen reached the same conclusion about the war that had come upon Bormann, Schacht, Skorzeny, and Himmler. Germany was losing and could do nothing about it. Several months later, Galen says, he began quietly discussing the impending defeat with a few close associates. As he writes in his memoir, quote, "Early in October of 1944, I told my more intimate colleagues that I considered the war was lost and we must begin thinking of the future. We had to think ahead and plan for the approaching catastrophe." Galen's strategic response to Götterdämmerung was a kind of fusion of Himmler's philosophy with Bormann's more pessimistic Odessa line. Quote, "My view," he writes, "was that there would be a place even for Germany in a Europe rearmed for defense against communism. Therefore, we must set our sights on the Western powers and give ourselves two objectives: to help defend against communist expansion and to recover and reunify Germany's lost territories." And again, Galen's view here basically is a synthesis of the Bormann and Himmler views and basically represents the Christian West concept which we're focusing on this evening. That Galen's conclusions, again, "My view," he writes, "was that there would be a place even for Germany in a Europe rearmed for defense against communism. Therefore, we must set our sights on the Western powers and give ourselves two objectives: to help defend against communist expansion and to recover and reunify Germany's lost territories." Just as Bormann, Skorzeny, and Schacht were beginning to execute their escape plans, so too was Galen. Quote, "Setting his sights on the Western powers," unquote, and in particular on the United States, Galen pursued the following strategic rationale. When the alliance between the United States and the USSR collapsed, as it was bound to do upon Germany's defeat, the United States would discover a piercing need for a top-quality intelligence service in Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union. It did not have such a service of its own, and the pressures of the erupting East-West conflict would not give it time to develop one from scratch. Let the United States, therefore, leave the assets assembled by Galen and the FHO intact. Let the United States not break up Galen's relationship with East European fascist groups. Let the United States pick up Galen's organization and put it to work for the West, the better to prevail in its coming struggle against the Soviet Union, soon to become its ex-ally. Galen brought his top staff people into the planning for this amazing proposal. Together, during the last months of the war, while Hitler was first raging at Galen for his, quote, defeatist, unquote, intelligence reports, then promoting him to the rank of brigadier general, then at last firing him altogether, but promoting into the FHO directorship one of Galen's co-conspirators, Galen and his staff carefully prepared their huge files on East Europe and the Soviet Union and moved them south into the Bavarian Alps and buried them. At the same time, Galen began building the ranks of the FHO intelligence agents. The FHO, in fact, was the only organization in the whole of the Third Reich that was actually recruiting new members as the war was winding down. SS men who knew they would be in trouble when the Allied forces arrived now came flocking to the FHO, knowing that it was the most secure place for them to be when the war finally ended. When Galen's plans were complete and his preparations all concluded, he divided his top staff into three separate groups and moved them, as Skorzeny was doing at the same time, into prearranged positions in Bavaria. Galen himself was in place before the German surrender on May 7th, hiding comfortably in a well-stocked chalet in a mountain lee called Misery Meadow. Besides Galen, there were 8 others in the Misery Meadow group, including 2 wounded men and 3 young women. For 3 weeks, maintaining radio contact with the 2 other groups, Galen and his colleagues stayed on the mountain, waiting for the American army to appear in the valley far below. Quote, "These days of living in the arms of nature were truly enchanting," unquote, he wrote. Quote, "We had grown accustomed to the peace, and our ears were attuned to nature's every sound," unquote. That's very touching. Let's pause here to take a look at what Oglesby has talked about in this last section of his article. Again, note that one of the key elements of the Galen organization, both when it was the Hitler organization in World War II and later when it jumped to U.S. intelligence, among the key components were the OUN B group of Stefan Bandera. We took a look at Bandera in the first 2 Radio Free America shows, in Radio Free America shows 14 and 15. and we also took a look at it in a big way in Radio Free America 36. We came back to the Bandera organization and the connections between the assassination of Stefan Bandera and the assassination of John Kennedy. The assassination of the former, allegedly at the hands of the KGB, was used by elements grouped around the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation, the seed group of the World Anti-Communist League, to help portray the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald as a communist assassin. The fear that that would provoke a third world war was one of the things which helped to persuade many people who knew otherwise to cover up the assassination and pin the assassination of JFK on Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut. And note again that Galen's approach was a synthesis of the Hitler and Himmler approaches, and basically Galen's approach was absolutely consistent. That is, his approach to defeat was absolutely consistent with the Christian West concept, which, as we've seen, it was a concept which gave rise directly to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was one that was hammered out during the World War II. The basic outlines for it were hammered out during World War II, not NATO proper, but the concept which obviously from which NATO grew was hammered out during World War II by German and American representatives of this transatlantic financial and industrial axis, explicitly fascist in character, and both the German and American industrialists and financiers were serving as functionaries of their respective intelligence apparats. And it's also worth noting, again, that as Oglesby points out, Fremde Herre Ost was one of the very few organizations which was, Third Reich organizations, which was still being built as World War II was drawing to a close. And note again, as we've noted in the first 3 Radio Free America shows, that many SS and Gestapo veterans jumped to the Galen organization, and in turn this paved the way for many SS and Gestapo people to move up into the U.S. intelligence system. We're going to proceed now with the next section of Reinhard Galen's, Carl Oglesby's article. Galen was still communing with nature when William Donovan, chief of the Office of Strategic Services, arrived in Nuremberg from Washington, dispatched by the new president to assist Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. Harry S. Truman had made Jackson the United States Chief Prosecutor with the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, established to try the Nazis' principal military leaders. Donovan's OSS was to function as an investigative arm of the IMT. By the last half of the war, if not before, President Roosevelt and Donovan were convinced that the U.S. needed a permanent intelligence service, and that this service, like the OSS, should be civilian rather than military. They were convinced, too, that the OSS should be its foundation. On October 31st, 1944, Roosevelt directed Donovan to prepare a memo on how such a service should be organized. Donovan consulted on this assignment with his colleague Allen Dulles, a force unto himself as wartime chief of OSS operations in Bern. Dulles advised Donovan to placate the military by proposing that the new agency be placed automatically under military command in time of war. Donovan's proposal incorporated this idea, but only in order to state all the more strongly the case for civilian control and for making the OSS the basis of the new organization. As he wrote in his memo to Roosevelt of November 18, 1944, quote, "There are common-sense reasons why you may desire to lay the keel of the ship at once. We have now in the OSS the trained and specialized personnel needed for such a task, and this talent should not be dispersed." Donovan proposed establishment of a civilian intelligence service responsible directly to the President and the Secretary of State, the chief mission of which would be to support the President in foreign policy. Except for the civilian Secretaries of War and the Navy, Donovan's plan did not even include a place for military representation on the advisory board, and he was careful to specify that the advisory board would merely advise and not control. The new service was to be all-powerful in its field, being responsible for, quote, "coordination of the functions of all intelligence agencies of the government," unquote. The Donovan Intelligence Service, in other words, would directly and explicitly dominate the Army's G2 and the Navy's ONI. Naturally, therefore, the Donovan plan drew an intense attack from the military. One G2 officer called it, quote, "cumbersome and possibly dangerous," unquote. Another referred to the OSS as, quote, "a bunch of faggots," unquote. Nor was the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover silent. Hoover had fought creation of the OSS perhaps more bitterly than the military, and had insisted throughout the war on maintaining an FBI intelligence network in Latin America, despite the fact that this was supposed to be OSS turf. Certain elements within Army intelligence were not only opposed to Donovan's plan, but were also beginning to formulate their own notions of what a post-war intelligence system should be like. Roosevelt sent the Joint Chiefs of Staff ultra-secret copies of Donovan's proposal, along with Roosevelt's own draft executive order to implement it. On January 1st, 1945, the chiefs formally reported to Roosevelt their extreme dissatisfaction with this scheme and leaked Donovan's memo to 4 right-wing newspapers, which leapt to the attack with blaring headlines accusing FDR and Donovan of conspiring to create a super Gestapo, unquote. This attack put the Donovan plan on hold, and the death of FDR on April 12, 1945, destroyed it. By the way, one factor I'm not going to discuss in this entire scenario, there are questions about the death of President Roosevelt, chiefly the fact that the Nazis, who, as I've mentioned, had the inner core of Nazism was built around an occult religious philosophy, and some of the Nazi leadership were into astrology, and the astrological forecasters for Adolf Hitler had forecast April 13th, 1945 as the day on which Nazi fortunes would change. Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. It was that date in the United States, but it was April 13th in Europe, because they're, I think, about 10 hours ahead of us, maybe 12. But in any event, it was April 13th in Europe. I am not a believer in astrology, and that in combination with a number of other things have led me to question whether Roosevelt's death was actually natural. We will never know, and at this point it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But it should be noted that Roosevelt, at the time that he died, was having his picture painted by a white Russian named Elizabeth Shumatov, who, along with another white Russian who had accompanied her, had engaged in a discussion with Roosevelt shortly before he died. The other white Russian there, when Roosevelt was talking about the enormous destruction that he had witnessed at Yalta from World War II, or Roosevelt had just come back, the other white Russian commented that it had obviously been it had probably been the Bolsheviks and not the Nazis who wreaked this destruction, which caused Roosevelt to raise his eyebrows. Roosevelt died shortly after that, and the aforementioned Shumatov and her companion, who said that the destruction at Yalta had probably been done by the Bolsheviks and not the Nazis, didn't even stop to find out how Roosevelt was. They climbed in their car and drove lickety-split through a driving rainstorm, and they didn't even hear that Roosevelt had died until they heard the news on the radio while driving away. 2 weeks later, Roosevelt's medical records disappeared from Bethesda Naval Hospital. Now, we cannot draw a conclusion from that, but it does raise some questions about Roosevelt's death. In particular, the Nazis forecast that as the day on which their fortunes would change. It's questionable whether Roosevelt would have permitted such a deal, that is, such a Gehlen organization deal, and the appeasement of the Third Reich which took place. And with the white Russian component so deeply involved in the Gehlen organization, as we've seen, white Russians were deeply involved in the assassination of John Kennedy many years later, and with the curious behavior of Shumatov and companion, and with the disappearance of Roosevelt's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital 2 weeks after his death, it does raise some questions. I would also note that one of Roosevelt's sons has publicly expressed his belief that FDR was murdered. But in any event, we will never know for sure. At this distance in time, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but it is a curious minor detail to ponder. Continuing now with Oglesby's article, in early May of 1945, President for less than a month, Truman made the OSS the American component of the investigative arm of the IMT. It is one of the fascinating conjunctions of this story that Donovan should have left for Nuremberg just as Gehlen was coming down from his mountain. It is one of its riper ironies that Donovan would soon resign from Jackson's staff in a disagreement over trying German officers as war criminals, which Donovan objected to but Jackson and Truman supported. Had Donovan lent his energies to the trial of Nazis within the German officer corps, he might have confronted the very adversaries who would shortly take his place in the American intelligence system, not only militarizing it, but Nazifying it as well. Now, with regard to the destruction of the OSS, one of the things we're going to look at next week is the role of a military intelligence official named John Frenchy Grombach, Grombach, and his role in destroying the OSS's Research and Analysis Division. Grombach is a key name in the resumption of the program that we're going to engage in next week. And it's also ironic that William Donovan resigned because of his disagreement at trying German officers as war criminals. We should note, obviously, that many of these officers were war criminals, and an awful lot of them, as noted here by Oglesby, jumped to the Galen organization. Also note here in passing that there is, at this particular juncture, already a development of the rivalry, the war that I've spoken about on other broadcasts that is still going on between the military and civilian intelligence agencies. And that's just as there was rivalry and some conflict between the Canaris group and the Siegerheitsdienst and later the Canaris and Galen people, so too there are conflicts within our own intelligence system. It's one of the reasons why when I refer to U.S. intelligence trafficking in drugs or supporting terrorism, I say elements of U.S. intelligence, because there are other elements that oppose that kind of thing. It's very important in analyzing the U.S. intelligence apparatus or military or intelligence or political organizations of this or other countries to recognize that very seldom are they monolithic, although often they will unify from a functional standpoint. We're going to skip down a little bit and resume with Oglesby's article. After Galen surrendered to the United States, we're going to skip down a little bit and resume with Oglesby's article. After Galen surrendered to the United States, Oglesby resumes the narrative here, saying, "Recognition was inevitable, however, since the Counterintelligence Corps was trying to find him being Galen. By mid-June at the latest, his name was recognized by a G2 officer, Colonel William H. Quinn, who had Galen brought to Augsburg for his first serious interrogation. Quinn was the first American to whom Galen presented his proposal and told of his staff dispersed at several camps in the mountains, as well as the precious buried archives of the FHO. Unlike Captain Porter, Colonel Quinn was impressed. He promptly passed Galen up the command chain to General Edwin L. Siebert, S-I-B-E-R-T. Siebert later recalled, quote, "I had a most excellent impression of him at once," unquote. Galen immediately began educating him as to, quote, "the actual aims of the Soviet Union and its display of military might," unquote. As Siebert told a journalist years later, quote, "With her present armed forces potential," Galen continued, "Russia could risk war with the West, and the aim of such a war would be the occupation of West Germany," unquote. Next week, we're going to see just how absolutely wacky that very concept was. One of the main ways that Galen was able to influence the post-World War II world, the Cold War, and one of the things which ultimately led to what I view, and I think I can substantiate this as the conquest of the United States, was the grossly exaggerated view that Galen presented of Soviet capabilities and intentions, and this ultimately, over the years, led to, and we will talk about this next week and the following, led to the bankrupting not just of the Soviet Union from the enormous arms race, but it also led to the bankrupting of the United States as well. The Soviet Union collapsed. We're merely a basket case at this time. But continuing here with the Oglesby's account, acting without orders, Siebert listened to Galen for several days before informing Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. Bedell is B-E-D-E-L, or perhaps Bedell. Smith and Siebert then continued to develop their relationship with Galen secretly, choosing not to burden Eisenhower with knowledge of what they were doing, quote, "in order not to compromise him in his relations with the Soviets," unquote. Eisenhower, in fact, had strictly forbidden U.S. fraternization with Germans. Now, I'm going to interrupt here at this point, and we're going to go back to the Hohne-Zerling book, The General Was a Spy, about Reinhard Galen. Now note here that the individual, and this is an individual that Galen formally credits with his rise, the individual who first established significant contact with Galen was the aforementioned General Edwin L. Siebert, again S-I-B-E-R-T. And it is not presented either in here or most of the other accounts of Galen, but we're going to take a look at just how it was that General Siebert came to view the incorporation of German officers, and obviously one of them, Reinhard Galen, as a useful thing for the American military and intelligence system to do in preparation for the post-war period. Returning once again to The General Was a Spy by Höhne and Zolling. So there entered Galen's life, this about General Edwin Siebert, so there entered Galen's life, the man primarily responsible for furthering the post-war career of the one-time Wehrmacht general. Edwin Luther Siebert, born in 1897, was an artillery expert, an ex-military attaché, and a professor of military science. Like Galen, he had entered the Secret Service world late in life. Since March of 1944, Siebert had been Chief of Intelligence to the 12th U.S. Army Group, which later advanced through France, and he had studied the ideas of the German military. While fighting was still in progress in France, he had been prepared to make use of Adolf Hitler's officers in the cause of American strategy. The idea had come from the German-American Gero von Gewernitz, advisor to Allen W. Dulles, the U.S. Secret Service officer in Bern. In November of 1944, Gewernitz had suggested to Siebert that, via certain intermediaries, he should contact war-weary German commanders at the front and urge them to surrender. Siebert combed the POW camps for German officers willing to contact their fellow officers still fighting, and he had soon assembled an adequate number willing to assist the Allies to bring the war to an end. So the individual who influenced General Siebert to pursue the policy which incorporated Galen was none other than the very Gero von Gewernitz, the assistant to Allen Dulles, who we looked at in the material from the Old Boys. Gero von Gewernitz, whose sister married Edmund Stinnes, and who himself was deeply involved with the transatlantic financial and industrial axis, which was central to the development of fascism. Gero von Gewernitz, acting, of course, as an agent for the Canaris Group, was also basically working as a triple agent and channeling espionage information back to the Third Reich, and it was through the contacts of Gero von Gewernitz and Hans Bernd Gesivius, a Canaris person who retained his rank in the SS, a Gestapo lawyer, and the awareness on the part of the Sicherheitsdienst, Schellenberg, and the SS and Himmler and other Nazi functionaries of this so-called resistance group, the plotters against Hitler, and how useful they could be for political purposes. Ultimately, this led, once again, at the risk of seeming repetitive, to the contact between Prince Max von Hohenlohe and Allen Dulles, von Hohenlohe acting as an SS emissary, and out of that again grew the Christian West concept, the seed idea for NATO, and Galen leapt right in the middle of this, quote, Christian West, and he was able to direct it in a most un-Christian fashion. So again, the importance of Gero von Gewernitz and this transatlantic financial and industrial axis is front and center here, and it is more than a little interesting to find where Edwin L. Siebert just happened to pick up this particular little idea. It doesn't appear to be an accident at all. Continuing now with Carl Oglesby's account. Galen was encouraged to resume contact with his FHO comrades who were still at large in Bavaria. One more time. Galen was encouraged to resume contact with his FHO comrades who were still at large in Bavaria, releasing them from their vow of silence. Galen was sufficiently confident of his American relationships by this time that he dug up his buried files and, in special camps, put his FHO experts to work preparing detailed reports on the Red Army for his American captors. Well before the end of June, he and his comrades were, quote, discharged from prisoner of war status so that we could move around at will, unquote. They were encouraged to form a unit termed a, quote, general staff cell, unquote, first within G2's historical research section, and then later in the 7th Army's Intelligence Center in Wiesbaden, where they worked in private quarters and were treated as VIPs. Very important section coming up here. Indeed, a partly declassified CIA document recapitulated this story in the early 1970s, noting that at this time, quote, Galen met with Admiral Karl Dönitz, D-O-E-N-I-T-Z, who had been appointed by Hitler as his successor during the last days of the Third Reich. Galen and the admiral were now in a U.S. Army VIP prison camp in Wiesbaden. Galen sought and received approval from Dönitz, too, unquote. And Oglesby goes on to comment, in other words, the German chain of command was still in effect, and it approved of what Galen was doing with the Americans. And in a footnote, he goes on to add, that is, Oglesby goes on to add, as Galen was about to leave for the United States, he left a message for Hermann Bonn, that was one of his aides, with another of his top aides, Gerhard Wessel, W-E-S-S-E-L. I would note that Gerhard Wessel ultimately became head of the BND after Galen resigned. Quote, I am to tell you from Galen that he has discussed with Hitler's successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, and Galen's superior and chief of staff, General Franz Halder, H-A-L-D-E-R, the question of continuing his work with the Americans. Both were in agreement, unquote. So, in addition to Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, Galen's chief of staff and superior, General Franz Halder, also approved of what Galen was doing. And again, the importance of this couldn't be exaggerated. And as Oglesby comments quite rightly, in other words, the German chain of command was still in effect, and it approved of what Galen was doing with the Americans. I don't doubt that one bit. Continuing now with Oglesby's account from Covert Action Information Bulletin. Galen's biographers are under the impression that it took 6 weeks for someone in European G2 to notice and recognize Galen in the POW cage, that Siebert did not tell Smith about finding him until the middle of August, and that it was much later still before Siebert and Smith conspired to circumvent Eisenhower and communicate their excitement about Galen to someone at the Pentagon, presumably associated with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But documents released in the 1980s show that this part of Galen's story raced along much more quickly. Already on June 29th, in fact, the Pentagon had informed Eisenhower's European command that the War Department wanted to see Galen in Washington. But, by the way, I would interject at this point, in all probability, Siebert himself had the okay from people even higher than Eisenhower. General Siebert would not have disobeyed the orders of a five-star general unless he had been able to go around him and go to a higher echelon. Continuing. It was a fast time. By no later than August 22nd, one of Galen's top associates, Hermann Baun, B-A-U-N, was forming what would become the intelligence and counterintelligence section of Galen's new organization. Galen himself, with retinue, was departing for Washington in General Beadle Smith's DC-3 for high-level talks with American military and intelligence officials. And the whole concept of the deal he was about to offer his conquerors had been approved by a Nazi chain of command that was still functioning, despite what the world thought and still does think was the Nazis' unconditional surrender. Galen arrived in Washington on August 24th with 6 of his top FHO aides and technical experts in tow. World War II had been over about a week. The war in Europe, about 3.5 months. So again, take note here that Galen makes contact with General Edwin L. Siebert, who just happened to get this idea to use German officers from none other than Gero von Gibernitz, one of the pivotal people we've been looking at tonight, and above all else, note the time frame here. Note how quickly this organization was being formed by August 22nd. Okay? The organization is being formed in a kind of concrete way, and again, the pivotal point here, take note that Admiral Karl Dönitz and General Franz Halder approve of what Galen is doing. So, in effect, Galen, here's where the Trojan horse concept can really be understood. Galen was acting in conjunction with a chain of command that, despite the official end of the war, was still functioning. So we're going to continue now with the next section of Carl Oglesby's article, and here we're going to take a look at some of the provisions of the secret treaty of Fort Hunt and some of the people who were involved in putting it together. Oglesby writes, as Galen and his 6 men were en route from Germany to Washington, Donovan's OSS troubles became critical. On August 23rd, Admiral William Leahy, L-E-A-H-Y, Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President's National Security Advisor, and a man who despised Donovan, advised Truman to order his Budget Director, Harold Smith, to begin a study of the intelligence question, stating, quote, this country wanted no Gestapo under any guise or for any reason, unquote. Truman may not have known that the Gestapo's Odessa heirs were landing in the lap of the Pentagon even as he spoke. Smith, in any case, responded to Truman's directive by asking Donovan for his OSS demobilization plans. Now, too late, Donovan tried to fight. The Galen Party, quote, Group 6, unquote, was checking out its very comfortable accommodations at Fort Hunt at the very moment at which Donovan, writing from a borrowed Washington office, fired back a memo to Smith defending the OSS and its right to live. Quote, among these assets of the OSS was establishment for the first time in our nation's history of a foreign secret intelligence service which reported information as seen through American eyes. As an integral and inseparable part of this service, there is a group of specialists to analyze and evaluate the material for presentation to those who determine national policy. Much more significant than the question of the adequacy of U.S. intelligence on the Soviet Union, however, was the question of civilian versus military control of the intelligence mission. Germany and England had fought this battle in the 19th century, the military capturing the intelligence role in Germany and the civilians maintaining a position in England. Throughout the summer and fall of 1945, this same battle raged in the U.S. government. The battle for intelligence control was indeed the background for the arrival of Galen and his 6 aides at Fort Hunt. Resuming again, the battle for intelligence control was indeed the background for the arrival of Galen and his 6 aides at Fort Hunt, where Galen's party was housed and Galen himself provided with an NCO butler and several white-jacketed orderlies. A momentous relationship was established at Fort Hunt, one that had the most profound effect on the subsequent evolution of United States foreign policy during an exceptionally difficult passage of world history. The period of the Cold War as a whole, and more especially its early formative years, from Galen's coming aboard the American Intelligence Service until he rejoined the West German Republic in 1955, was laden with the peril of nuclear war. By the way, I think that actually would have been 56, the formal incorporation of the Federal Republic. Continuing. On at least one occasion, in 1948, Galen almost convinced the United States that the Soviet Union was about to launch a war against the West and that it would be in the U.S. interest to preempt it. By the way, we're going to take a look at that next week. Clearly, it is important to know who made and authorized the decisions that led to our national dependency on a network of underground Nazis, yet because the relevant documents are still classified, this central part of the Galen story still cannot be reconstructed. By the way, I would also interject, for people that still think that perhaps this is a little bit too arcane to be talking about in 1992, take note that as of 1990, these documents about the Treaty of Fort Hunt were still classified. Continuing with Oglesby's account, from the handful of published books about the Galen affair, none of which cite their sources on this point, we can list only 7 Americans who were said to be involved with Galen at Fort Hunt. Admiral William D. Leahy, Chief of Staff and Truman's National Security Advisor, a familiar name's about to come up, Allen Dulles, OSS Station Chief in Berne during the war, Sherman Kent, head of OSS Research and Analysis Branch and a Yale historian, General George V. Strong, head of Army G2, Major General Alex H. Bolling of G2, B-O-L-L-I-N-G, Brigadier General John T. Magruder, M-A-G-R-U-D-E-R, first head of the Army Strategic Services Unit of Vulture of OSS, and Loftus E. Becker, B-E-C-K-E-R, a lawyer associated with G2 and the Nuremberg War Crimes Operation, the CIA's first deputy director. We do not know if these people were involved as a committee, if they talked with Galen and his 6 aides a lot or a little, separately or all at once, or if they sent their own aides to work out the details. We do not know how a POW interrogation was transformed into a bargaining process. Above all, we do not know what kind of communication the U.S. participants in the Fort Hunt Galen talks had with the political authorities to whom they were responsible. Leahy is the only one who had obvious contact with President Truman, but there is nothing in the revealed record to indicate that he ever discussed Galen or the Fort Hunt deal with Truman, or took the least trouble to explain to Truman the implications of hiring a Nazi spy network. We have no idea, for that matter, how Leahy himself saw it. What we do know is the outlines of the Galen deal itself, however it was hammered out and however it was or was not ratified by legal political authority. That is because Galen himself laid out its terms in his autobiography, The Service. Galen says in this work, which has been attacked for its inaccuracies, that the discussions ended with a, quote, gentleman's agreement, unquote, that the terms of his relationship with the United States were, quote, for a variety of reasons never set down in black and white, unquote. He continues, again quoting, such was the element of trust that had been built up between the two sides during this year of intensive personal contact, too bad it wasn't conflict. Such was the element of trust that had been built up between the two sides during this year of intensive personal contact that neither had the slightest hesitation in founding the entire operation on a verbal agreement and a handshake, unquote. Of course, as we've seen, this particular deal was the outgrowth of a long process of negotiation, much of which a long process of rapprochement, shall we say, which I've been outlining this evening, or detailing this evening. Continuing. According to Galen, this agreement consisted of the following 6 basic points. His language is worth savoring. Quote, I remember the terms of the agreement well, he wrote. 1. A clandestine German intelligence organization was to be set up using the existing potential to continue information gathering in the East just as we had been doing before. The basis for this was our common interest in a defense against communism. 2. This German organization was to work not for or under the Americans, but, quote, jointly with the Americans, unquote. Again, the Christian West concept. The organization would operate exclusively under German leadership, which would receive its directives and assignments from the Americans until a new government was established in Germany. 4. The organization was to be financed by the Americans with funds which were not to be part of the occupation costs, and in return the organization would supply all its intelligence reports to the Americans, unquote. 5. As soon as a sovereign German government was established, that government should decide whether the organization should continue to function or not, but that until such time the care and control, later referred to as the trusteeship of the organization, would remain in American hands. 6, and this is very important, should the organization at any time find itself in a position where the American and German interests diverged, it was accepted that the organization would consider the interests of Germany first. And indeed, as we look back and we see the functioning of the Galen organization over the years, and we're going to take a look at how it screwed things up next week. We've already taken a look at how it helped screw up President Kennedy, but indeed, I think history will attest to just how accurate this is. Again, quoting, should the organization at any time find itself in a position where the American and German interests diverged, it was accepted that the organization would consider the interests of Germany first. Take this and the fact that Galen was acting with the approval of a supposedly demobilized Third Reich command structure, and the degree to which the Galen organization can indeed be seen, as Oglesby has pointed out, not only as a vehicle for the Odessa, but beyond that, as a Trojan horse. The extent to which that can be accepted as true, I think, can be assessed at this point. We're going to continue. Galen acknowledges that the last point especially might, quote, raise some eyebrows, unquote, and make some think that the U.S. side, quote, had gone overboard in making concessions to us, unquote. He assures his readers that actually, quote, this point demonstrates better than any other Siebert's great vision. He recognized that for many years to come, the interests of the United States and West Germany must run parallel, unquote. Galen and his staff left Fort Hunt for Germany on July 1st, 1946, having been in the United States almost a year. They were temporarily based at Oberursel, then settled into a permanent base in a walled-in, self-contained village at Pullach near Munich. Oberursel is O-B-E-R-U-R-S-E-L, Pullach is P-U-L-L-A-C-H. Galen set up his headquarters in an estate originally built by Martin Bormann. There, a startup group of 50 began to turn the, quote, gentleman's agreement, unquote, of Fort Hunt into a reality. The first order of business being staff, Galen's recruiters were soon circulating among the unemployed mass of former Nazi SS men, the Odessa constituency, to find more evaluators, couriers, and informers. Galen had, quote, solemnly promised in Washington not to employ SS and Gestapo men, unquote, although it will be noted that Galen includes no such provision in his list of terms. There is not the least question that he did recruit such men, supplying them with new names when necessary. Recall that in Radio Free America shows 1, 2, and 3 and others, we've taken a look at the liberal use, the massive use of SS and Gestapo veterans in the Gehlen organization. Of this, Oglesby writes, two of the worst of them were Franz Seix, S-I-X, and Emil Augsburg, A-U-G-S-B-U-R-G. Seix was a key Nazi intellectual, and both Seix and Augsburg were associated with the Wannsee Institute, the Nazi think tank in Berlin, where SS leader Reinhard Heydrich in January of 1942 announced, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question, unquote. Both of them had commanded extermination squads roving in East Europe in pursuit of Jews and communists, and both had gone underground with the Odessa when the Third Reich crumbled. Augsburg hid in Italy, then returned in disguise when Gehlen called. Seix was actually captured by Allied intelligence, tried at Nuremberg, and imprisoned, only to be sprung to work with Augsburg running Gehlen's networks of East European Nazis. I would add that the person who sprung Franz Alfred Seix, as we looked at in Radio Free America program number 2, was none other than John J. McCloy, the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, who also, along with Allen Dulles, served on the Warren Commission. Continuing. From the edge of total defeat, Gehlen now moved into his vintage years more powerful, influential, and independent than he had ever been in the heyday of the Third Reich. Minimally supervised first by the War Department Strategic Services Unit under Fort Hunt figure Major General John Magruder, and then by the SSU's follow-on organization, the Central Intelligence Group under Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, S-O-U-E-R-S, the org grew to dominate the entire West German intelligence service. Through his close ties to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's chief minister, Hans Globke, Gehlen was able to place his men in positions of control in West Germany's military intelligence and the internal counterintelligence arm. When NATO was established, he came to dominate it, too. By one estimate, quote, some 70%, unquote, of the total intelligence take flowing into NATO's military committee and Allied headquarters shape on the Soviet Union, the countries of East Europe, and the rest of Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, was generated at Pulak. Not even the establishment of the CIA in 1947 and the official transfer of the Pulak operation into the West German government in July of 1955, when it was retitled the Federal Intelligence Service, or BND, lessened the reliance of American intelligence on Gehlen's product. The last sentence again. Not even the establishment of the CIA in 1947 and the official transfer of the Pulak operation into the West German government in July of 1955, when it was retitled the Federal Intelligence Service, BND, lessened the reliance of American intelligence on Gehlen's product. From the beginning days of the Cold War through the 1970s and beyond, the United States, West Germany's, and NATO's most positive beliefs about the nature and intentions of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and world communism would be supplied by an international network of utterly unreconstructed SS Nazis whose primary purposes were to cover the escape of the Odessa and make the world safe for Nazism. So once again, reviewing some of the central points of this last section, note we have our old buddy Allen Dulles hooked right up there with the group that was negotiating with Reinhard Gehlen and working out the Fort Hunt Treaty, and we don't really know what was said because the documents still were classified as of 1990. Note again that when German and American interests were perceived as diverging, it was understood that the Gehlen organization, at least according to Gehlen, and who should know better than he was in a position to control, that the organization would act on behalf of German interests first, and boy did they do that. I would also note again that the Gehlen organization was not only the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs, sole purveyors of intelligence on that part of the world, but even after it became the BND, we remained dependent on it for our view of what was going on, and also, obviously, it then became the West German Intelligence Service as well. This organization, the Gehlen organization, wielded an enormous effect on the post-World War II history. Again, it was at the center of our own intelligence system, and as we will look at next week, it badly warped our own perceptions of what was going on in the world. It basically functioned as the eyes and ears for NATO, and as it was helping to shape NATO, and after it was already deeply shaping U.S. perceptions of the Cold War, it was installed as the West German Intelligence Service. And as we'll see next week, it also, Gehlen-related elements became involved in domestic American politics, some of these Third Reich émigrés, and ultimately, on November 22nd, 1963, these elements took a most active role in American politics. Namely, they participated in the assassination of President Kennedy. The last section of Oglesby's article is called The Cost of the Fort Hunt Treaty, and it reads, Gehlen's story has many branchings beyond this point. These include several key spy scandals that exposed his organization as dangerously vulnerable to Soviet penetration. They include the pitiful spectacle of U.S. CIC agents pursuing Nazi fugitives on war crimes charges, only to see them summarily pardoned and hired by Gehlen. They include the dark saga of Klaus Barbie, the SS butcher of Lyon, unquote, who worked with the Gehlen organization and boasted of being a member of the Odessa. They include aspects of Operation Paperclip, in which right-wing forces in the U.S. military once again savaged the concept of denazification in order to smuggle scores of SS rocket scientists into the United States. By the way, we're going to take a look at the role of the Paperclip people also in the winning of World War II for the Third Reich during the course of this broadcast. Continuing. They include continuation of the civilian versus military conflict over the institution of secret intelligence and the question of politically motivated covert action within the domestic interior. Note this. The continuation of the civilian versus military conflict over the institution of secret intelligence and the question of politically motivated covert action within the domestic interior. We saw that with the assassination of John Kennedy and other things. They include, continuing with Oglesby's account, they include above all the story of the enormous victory of the Odessa in planting powerful Nazi colonies around the world, in such countries as South Africa, where the enactment of apartheid laws followed, or several countries in Latin America that then became breeding grounds for the death squads of the current day, and indeed even in the United States, where it now appears that thousands of wanted Nazis were able to escape justice and grow old in peace. In making the Gehlen deal, the United States did not acquire for itself an intelligence service. That is not what the Gehlen Group was or was trying to be. The military intelligence historian Colonel William Corson, C-O-R-S-O-N, put it most succinctly, quote, Gehlen's organization was designed to protect the Odessa Nazis. It amounts to an exceptionally well-orchestrated diversion, unquote. The only intelligence provided by the Gehlen net to the United States was intelligence selected specifically to worsen East-West tensions and increase the possibility of military conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was exactly as the right-wing papers had warned in 1945 when they were aroused by Donovan's proposal for a permanent intelligence corps, warning their readers that a, quote, super spy unit, unquote, could, again quoting, determine American foreign policy by weeding out, withholding, or coloring information gathered at his direction, unquote. It was exactly as Truman had warned when he demobilized the OSS, with the observation that the U.S. had no interest in, quote, Gestapo-like measures, unquote. The fact that this lively concern for a police state apparatus should have been focused on the relatively innocuous OSS, while at the same time the red carpet was being rolled out for Gehlen's gang of SS men, must surely count as one of the supreme, wrenching ironies of the modern period. Another dimension of the cost of the Gehlen deal is the stress it induced within American institutions, weakening them incalculably. The Gehlen organization was the antithesis of the Allied cause, its sinister emergence on the scene of post-war Europe, the very opposite of what the Western democracies thought they had been fighting for. Perhaps at least we can say that despite Gehlen, and despite the military, the United States did, after all, finally wind up with a civilian intelligence service. The National Security Act of 1947 did embody Donovan's central point in creating a CIA outside the military. But in fact, the Gehlen org substantially preempted the CIA's civilian character before it was ever born. The CIA was born to be rocked in Gehlen's cradle. It remained dependent on the org even when the org turned into the BND. Thus, whatever the CIA was from the standpoint of the law, It remained, from the standpoint of practical intelligence collection, a front for a house of Nazi spies. The org was not merely military, which is bad, not merely foreign, which is much worse, and not merely Nazi, which is intolerable. It was not even professionally committed to the security of the U.S. and Western Europe. It was committed exclusively to the security of the Odessa. All the Gehlen org ever wanted the U.S. to be was anti-communist. The more militantly so, the better. It never cared in the least for the security of the United States, its Constitution, or its democratic tradition. It is not the point of this essay that there would have been no Cold War if the Odessa had not wanted it and had not been able, through the naive collaboration of the American military right, to place Gehlen and his network in a position that ought to have been occupied by a descendant of the OSS. But it was precisely because the world was so volatile and confusing as of the transition from World War II to peacetime that the U.S. needed to see it, as Donovan put in his plaintive appeal to Truman in the summer of 1945, quote, through American eyes, unquote. No Nazi eyes, however bright, could see it for us without deceiving us and leading us to the betrayal of our own national character. Second, there was no way to avoid the Cold War once we had taken the desperate step of opening our doors to Gehlen. From that moment on, from the summer of 1945, when the Army brought him into the United States and made a secret deal with him, the Cold War was locked in. A number of Cold War historians on the left, for example D.F. Fleming and Gabriel Kolko, K-O-L-K-O, have made cogent arguments that from the Soviet point of view, the Cold War was not inevitable even as late as 1947. According to standard American history, in fact, it was only in 1947 that the Cold War was thrust upon us by an irrational and belligerent Stalin. The story of the secret treaty of Fort Hunt exposes this, quote, history, unquote, as a self-serving political illusion. On the contrary, the war in the Pacific was still raging, and the United States was still trying to get the Soviet Union into the war against Japan when General Siebert was already deep into his relationship with Gehlen. The key point that comes crashing through the practical and moral confusion about this matter once one sees that Gehlen's organization was an arm of the Odessa is that whether it was ethical or not, the U.S. did not pick up the gift horse in Gehlen at all. It picked up a Trojan horse. The unconditional surrender the Germans made to the Allies, the unconditional surrender the Germans made to the Allied command at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Rhin was the surrender only of the German armed services. It was not the surrender of the hard SS core of the Nazi Party. The SS did not surrender, unconditionally or otherwise, and thus Nazism itself did not surrender. The SS chose, rather, to seek other means of continuing the war, while the right wing of the United States military establishment, through fears and secret passions and a naivete of its own, chose to facilitate that choice. The history that we have lived through since then stands witness to the consequences. And a few quotes from this last section of the article, I think, sum up the Gehlen organization. And next week and in the next 2 weeks, we're going to take a look at just how this was done. And in viewing how this was done, we will see the formation of the milieu that we were looking at in Peter Dale Scott's brilliant manuscript, The Dallas Conspiracy, this petroleum, intelligence, Third Reich, American far-right national security milieu, of which George Bush was part and parcel. This milieu is in charge of the destiny of this country and the world to this day. A few sections of the concluding section of Oglesby's article that I think are worth reiterating. One where he quotes Colonel William Corson, a military intelligence historian, also an advisor, I believe, to the Church Committee. Quote, Gehlen's organization was designed to protect the Odessa Nazis. It amounts to an exceptionally well-orchestrated diversion, unquote. The only intelligence provided by the Gehlen net to the United States was intelligence selected specifically to worsen East-West relations and increase the possibility of military conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Skipping down, another dimension of the cost of the Gehlen deal is the stress it induced within American institutions, weakening them incalculably. The Gehlen organization was the antithesis of the Allied cause, its sinister emergence on the scene of post-war Europe the very opposite of what the Western democracies thought they had been fighting for. And skipping down again. The CIA But in fact, the Galen org substantially preempted the CIA's civilian character before it was ever born. The CIA was born to be rocked in Galen's cradle. It remained dependent on the org even when the org turned into the BND. Thus, whatever the CIA was from the standpoint of the law, it remained from the standpoint of practical intelligence collection a front for a house of Nazi spies. And again, of the Galen organization, the org was not merely military, which is bad, not merely foreign, which is much worse, and not merely Nazi, which is intolerable. It was not even professionally committed to the security of the U.S. and Western Europe. It was committed exclusively to the security of the Odessa. All the Galen org ever wanted the U.S. to be was anti-communist, the more militantly so, the better. It never cared in the least for the security of the United States, its Constitution, or its democratic tradition. And again, the conclusion. The SS did not surrender, unconditionally or otherwise. By the way, Reims here is R-E-I-M-S, that's a city in France. The unconditional surrender of the Germans made to the Allied command at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Reims was the surrender only of the German armed services. It was not the surrender of the hard SS core of the Nazi Party. The SS did not surrender, unconditionally or otherwise, and thus Nazism itself did not surrender. The SS chose, rather, to seek other means of continuing the war, while the right wing of the United States military establishment, through fears and secret passions and a naivete of its own, chose to facilitate that choice. The history that we have lived through since then stands witness to the consequences. Well, to that I would of course add that this naivete of the American military right wing cannot be seen but in the context of the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that we've been looking at this evening. And again, the NATO organization, at the apex of which the Galen organization, again, basically an Odessa front for all practical purposes, a Trojan horse, the NATO organization, at the core of which the Galen organization was placed, was basically a development of the Christian West concept, which we saw both German and American intelligencers themselves part and parcel to this transatlantic industrial and financial axis. We saw them forming it during World War II. What we're going to look at next week is just exactly how the Galen organization affected the Cold War, how it affected American perceptions and operations, and how it began to affect American domestic political life, and ultimately the effects of the Galen organization on American domestic political life peaked and reached a crescendo with the assassination of John Kennedy on 11/22/63. We've already taken a look in the first two installments of this archive show at the presence of Galen and ABN-related elements in that particular action, namely the assassination of President Kennedy. And again, in evaluating the Galen organization, not only was it our exclusive purveyor of intelligence to Eastern Europe, it was, for all practical purposes, the NATO intelligence organization, and then when it became the West German CIA, basically the BND, it still was our main purveyor of intelligence on that part of the world. The effects of an organization like that, and in particular with its explicit Nazi character, could not be exaggerated, and its incorporation, as we will see during the next few installments, at least two more, possibly three, of this archive show, it was the vehicle for winning World War II for the Reich, and its incorporation into the United States as a result of the events that we've been studying and the processes we've been studying so far was the dominant factor in determining how the United States lost the Second World War.